And welcome, everyone. This is another episode of the Mind Sculptors podcast. I am your host, Callahan, and today I have two lovely co-hosts from right here in my not my hometown, my current place of residence of Lincoln, Nebraska, is my good friend, close ally, and only person I ever play in paper magic with anymore is Phoenix. How you doing today, buddy?
Good. It is actually my hometown, so
yes.
Your statement was like, if you just kept going, I think we could have got there. We could have figured it out.
Yeah, it's good to have you back on. It's been a minute. I think the last episode you were on was the Brewer's Choice episode with Ian about a month or so ago.
I'm not sure.
But it's good to have you back. He's an active part of our community. We love Phoenix. Also joining us today is the all the way up there from Ontario, right?
No, from Quebec.
Quebec. Okay, I'll get it right eventually. Is our good friend Pongo. Pongo, how you doing? The Frenchman himself, Pongo.
Doing well. Thanks for having me again, as usual.
Yeah. So before we get into anything today, want to just give a quick shout out to everybody who has been supporting us and helping us along the way. Just a reminder, if you like this episode, please give us a thumbs up, subscribe, comment down below. It really helps us out. If you're listening to us on a audio platform like Spotify or Apple Podcasts, give us a review, rate us. That would be really cool. That also helps us in those areas as well. And if you also want to see Phoenix, as you heard in our last episode, Ian was talking about how with the Stranger Things Secret Lair, his favorite part of it was watching Phoenix and Gustav lose their minds over Mike the Dungeon Master. You can see that happen in real time if you join our Discord, and you can get access to that by going to the Patreon link down in the description below. So I got a question for you guys. Do either of you use TikTok very much?
No, I'm not a heavy
Neither
TikTok
of you
user.
use TikTok.
Well, I wouldn't say neither because I use it a bit.
You use it a bit. Okay. So I want to, before we get into anything, we're going to enjoy a little something together. Something that's going viral, as one might say.
Are we destroying our own elementary schools? Is that the latest?
No,
fad?
that's not the thing. So if you recall, there's a little show called Sesame Street. And I'm not sure if you guys are aware, but Elmo has a friend. Let me see here. Who has an imaginary friend that's a pet rock. And this has been going viral on YouTube, or not on YouTube, but on TikTok, of Elmo being gaslit by this rock.
Can Elmo have an oatmeal raisin cookie instead, please?
Oh, gee, Elmo, that was my last one.
Oh, that's okay, Gabby. Elmo will just take this one.
No, wait, Elmo.
What?
Rocco says that he wants the oatmeal raisin cookie.
Rocco? Rocco's a rock, Zoe. Rocco won't know the difference.
Yes, he will. You can't have that cookie, Elmo. Rocco wants to eat it.
How? How is Rocco going to eat that cookie, Zoe? Tell Elmo. Rocco doesn't even have a mouth. Rocco's just a rock. Rocco's not alive.
Yeah, I feel that.
That's
That
basically
is-
me reacting to Mike.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's I have got so much joy from this. And so last night on SNL, on Weekend Update, they brought out somebody in an Elmo suit to make fun of this. And it was funny because on the SNL subreddit, half the people knew exactly what was going on and thought it was hilarious. And there were a bunch of other people who were like, why the hell did they have Elmo come? For the people who get this
do you
thing.
actually need to justify having Elmo as a special guest? I feel kind of feels like
Elmo's a savage, man.
like That's like a pretty excellent. Like I would 100% have Elmo guest star on our podcast. Like that just feels like you don't turn your nose to Elmo doing.
If you've seen like
a guest appearance
clips of him on like Jimmy Fallon and stuff, he's like actually the people who like play him and improvise him are like genuinely funny people.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
But anyway, that's not why you clicked on this video. I just needed to share that with the class because I have gotten immeasurable joy from that. And I want you all to have immeasurable joy as well. So last week, what day did that video come out? Melissa Del Toro and Gavin Verhey did how often do they do these Commander retrospectives?
It really varies. They did this one on January 12th, which was about 4 days ago as of recording this.
Yeah. So, but they've done them before for other sets. And for this one, they did it on Commander 16, which is probably one of the most notorious Commander sets to ever come out, ever. And they had a lot of opinions about different cards, some of the mechanics, the mistakes, all those things. And they talked about partner a lot. But we really, in cEDH, really only care about Commander 16 in that partner was the defining thing of that set for us, right? Like Pongo, you've talked about a lot in the past how like that 3 month span, right, between Kaladesh and Aether Revolt, where those 3 sets came out, really just redefined what cEDH was. Yeah.
There's, a time before that period and a time after that period. We're in the time after that period. And, the format has never been the same, right? We still feel essentially all of that stuff, the prevalence of partner,
right?
A lot of those win conditions, still see play. They're slowly starting to, be less represented in the format through a combination of, bans and optimizations and stuff like that. New win conditions taking their place. But ultimately, yeah, that's it. Partners are here with us, and it seems like they're here to stay.
Yeah, I think we got 56 new cards in Commander 16, and I legitimately think I've seen maybe about 30 to 40 of them in cEDH games.
Yeah. I mean, even one of the we're not going to talk too deeply about it, but they talked about Undaunted and the mechanic of it. And I mean, we play, what is it?
Divergent Transformation.
Divergent Transformation. That's what it's called. So, I mean,
which came out later, right?
No, it came out in C16.
That was in C16.
Yeah.
Okay. That was one of the Undaunted cards. I think you kind of forget that card has Undaunted, but
there's a lot of you forget that these cards came out in this set because partners are in this set. There's a lot of those cards in this set.
Yeah. Right. And interestingly enough, the reason why I guess I was confused about that card is that it was not really one that people played with until, quite a bit later.
Right.
And, a big part of that, I imagine, would just be, red has become more represented. The options in playing red have gotten better. But also people, I guess, have looked back at that card and figured out new fun things to do with it as well. But I'm sure Rograk is not at all to blame either.
Yeah. Roger did nothing for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what we're going to do, we're going to go similarly to how Gavin and Melissa went through, and we're going to start with each face commander and work our way down from that. So we'll start with the Yidris deck, and Yidris is a commander that sees some play in cEDH, right? We saw it pop up in the MLC. I believe Ian drafted that list, correct?
Yes. Yeah, Ian drafted that.
So that sees some play, but as far as the other face commanders, they don't really see. So starting with the Yidris deck, the first partner in that is Vial Smasher the Fierce, which is the black-red, the only black-red partner that exists. If you're unfamiliar with Vial Smasher, It is a 1 colorless black-green goblin berserker. Whenever you cast your first spell each turn, choose an opponent at random, and Vial Smasher deals damage equal to that spell's mana value to that player or planeswalker that player controls. And of course, his partner is a 2/3. So, Pongo, I think we'll look at you first for a second, because I know Vial Smasher has obviously been a very common cEDH commander, right?
Yeah, actually, what's really interesting about this card is that there's kind of like waves of Vial Smasher in the format. There's like the first wave of partner decks, and even before Thrasios Tymna kind of like really became established and like became the sort of premier deck of the format, people were actually experimenting with Thrasios Vial Smasher, and that's sort of like where the earliest. Some of the earliest Paradox Scepter decks were in Sans White, just because, kind of the thinking at that time, the theory at that time was that for your card pool in red was more strongly supportive of the Stormy type plan, thanks to, almost entirely Wheel of Fortune. And then also, you were getting the red blasts and stuff like that. So yeah, you actually ended up seeing very early on these Paradox Engine brews centered around Thrasios, where they also had this Stormy plan, and people valued red for that. It didn't take very long after that for people to kind of realize that Tymna, which we'll get to later,
right,
is a good card. I won't go into too much detail about that, but yeah, so that was kind of like the first wave. And then, there was like a little less interest in Vial Smasher because, again, people kind of realized that, there's better things you can be doing with Thrasios. There was eventually a deck that came out, which was the Thrasios Vial Smasher, sort of like Turbo Druid decks. Those ended up being a bit represented in the format. And, you still see them to some extent nowadays, but, early on, there was like a lot of emphasis on like the Lightning Druid style deck, which was, trying to do the Druid thing and like the all-in wins kind of as fast as possible, like always trying to mulligan to, like a turn 1 or turn 2 Hermit Druid, and win on the following turn, along with, like the Hulk type combos and stuff like that. This was just a deck that was dedicated fast pretty much. And it needed red for access to Torch Courier in particular. And then moving on from there, these days, red has become a much more
Wait. Are we
card.
just going to brush over 4-color Rashmi as a deck, though?
Yes.
Yeah. I was kind of getting to that. Well, on the one hand, yes, you've got 4-color Rashmi, which I think happened before we got the stronger red cards, so I should probably mention it now. Obviously just playing into like the Pyroclasm type effects, and like this was strong because it was like a specific meta counter against like the Thrasios Tymna decks, which were very prevalent because of Flash Hulk being legal at the time. But yeah, I guess fast forward to now, and we're kind of talking about there is like some penetration of Thrasios Vial Smasher. It's not a super common deck anymore, for this sort of like Sans White, like turbo-y style Nas deck, which you can build kind of in two different ways. You've obviously got like the sort of more all-in versions, and then you've got like the kind that are really looking to like actually be able to use Thrasios. And these are like, turbo-y, but still somewhat mid-rangey at the same time. And those are sort of most closely associated with like, our friends over at Into the North, who have had some success with that deck historically in events. And I don't think they played a whole lot anymore, which is the interesting thing. So yeah, Vial Smasher has a storied history in the format. Yeah. Even though he was never kind of the point.
Yeah, well, and I think it's Vial Smasher's a she, but
oh, you're right. Vial Smasher is a she.
The interesting thing with Vial Smasher is there's always been this kind of underlying belief that it was just there for the colors, right? But there were some decks that did do some pretty interesting things with Vial Smasher with the curiosity effects, right?
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in there. I played this deck for a long time.
Yes, you did.
I think when I met you, this was one of the decks that I very often played. I mean, Curious Control just uses the fact that I cast a counter spell, Thrasios, or not Thrasios, gosh. Vial. We're getting to Thrasios eventually here. Vial Smasher triggers, gives you a curiosity trigger, and then you draw some cards. And then like Pongo was saying, the exact meta that it was preying on when it originally came out was using the Pyroclasm effects to attack Tymna. Right. And because Vial Smasher is 3 toughness, Thrasios has 3 toughness, you live through the Pyroclasms, and then everyone else loses all their resources. And then just for other context, things that Melissa and Gavin also talked about, since this is kind of a reaction, but also kind of just that we're doing a retrospective on C16.
Yeah.
So they talked about as well Vial Smasher being actually pretty ridiculous in 1v1. And this is kind of an example of this set is definitely a set where they tried to design for multiplayer and take single player out of the equation. And you can see some design issues that came up with that when maybe we'll talk about it later with one of the mechanics. And then Vial Smasher is an example of something that was designed with no thought towards single player.
And that was one of the things that I thought was interesting, because I had never considered before that they think deeply about like 1v1 commander. Obviously, they don't override things, right? I believe Melissa said that in the episode. 1v1 will never override multiplayer in a commander, but we'd like to take into account 1v1. I didn't know that they even thought about that. That was one of the things I learned in that episode. But
yeah, I mean, if I can just jump in here for 1 second, so Gavin and Melissa are obviously kind of, when they're evaluating these decks, they're evaluating them, I think, with a lot of consideration for their colleagues and all of that. And that's all well and good. I agree that's important. We're sort of less beholden to that. I think what we can say sort of off the bat is that it does not feel like design understood how to design for Commander at this point.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's like something that we're probably going to get into quite a bit over the course of this discussion. It just feels like a lot of mistakes were made here. And it feels like, on the one hand, that's sort of to be expected when you're kind of doing this sort of for like the first few times. But on the other hand, some of these cards, if we're being a little less generous, feel like, okay, I mean, like these cards were clearly designed to be like really, really strong and like to push the deck to like be more of a financial success. And like, so on the one hand, we've learned how to design these cards better, but on the other hand, we've also realized that we don't need to push the power level of these cards for these products to do well. And so, I mean, that's kind of like, maybe my tinfoil hat theorizing about how some of these cards came into existence. But I also kind of feel like if you look at the design and like some of the cards that came out of these early commander decks, like you see, it's very clear that some of these cards were intended to be like really like chased after, like really sought after cards.
Right.
Yeah. And I mean, you can even jump in with this. I'm trying to think. Does anyone know off the top of their head when they stopped doing the 5 commander deck commander series releases? Was it 2018? I think that sounds about right. I'm estimating.
When we started doing more of like the per set cycle,
and then we like instead of having like one commander set per.
It was around 2019 because it was right before the pandemic hit.
And so this. And Gavin and Melissa even talked about this as like a flawed concept for even just like the product of just like people wanted 4-color commanders. We didn't have 4-color commanders, and 4-color commanders make bad precons. And that's kind of my opinion of these precons in general and kind of what they were tiptoeing around. But they did mention that like making 4-color precons was a mistake.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's, something that they learned by doing, right? I guess, again, giving the benefit of the doubt to the designers, it's not necessarily entirely self-evident that when you put more colors into your commander, the deck is inherently better. I think that from a sort of naive perspective, you might think, oh, well, some of these cards get harder to cast. But again, then when you start looking at partners, you begin to realize that like some of these design principles that may work as like safety valves in other contexts, like having to pay like 4 different colors of mana for Atraxa or whatever, don't really apply anymore.
Right.
And so as such, you run into this issue where the cards are sort of unbalanced based on heuristics that you're sort of applying incorrectly.
Well, and one of the things I think is important to note here as, we go through this is this set is 6 years old, and is certainly, which means it was in design 7 to 8 years ago. And that, like, you can see the design principles of that, like, team as they grow and learn all the way up until now. Right. And so, like, I think this is definitely, we've learned a lot about Commander as a format, I think, over the last 6 years, just as a whole. And I think the last 2 years has even given further definition to the format that we didn't have before. Like, I think, not to get too far off topic, but like, I mean, I think like the flash banning really signaled like what the format is, if that makes sense. And did a lot for shaping the format in a really interesting way. If that made any sense whatsoever.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like I was talking about before, there's like a pre C16 format and a post C16 format.
Yeah.
Did we want to finish off our thoughts on Vial Smasher?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so I guess, yeah, we kind of touched upon sort of like the main things where Vial Smasher, at least in the context of cEDH, sort of predominantly is for her colors. Secondarily, people have actually built around Vial Smasher as like an actual potential engine. If we look at things that sort of occurred in the format after C16 came out, obviously Vial Smasher provides some value for like Neoform, getting like Notion Thief. That was kind of always an angle people did with her. And then naturally there's Vial Smasher, the Menace, in 1v1, which, kind of just goes to show that some of these designs were clearly not, there was not a holistic perspective on these designs, really. They kind of, like when they're designing a lot of the time for standard, don't necessarily always consider the implications for other formats and stuff like that.
Yeah. The next card on the list is Kydel, Chosen of Kruphix. And if you're unfamiliar with Kydel, she is a 2 colorless, a green and a blue human wizard, which is a 2/3. And she has an ability that says tap, add colorless for each card you've drawn this turn. And so as far as Kydel, I'm not aware of many Kydel decks that have existed to any like great degree in cEDH.
So I don't know if any that have posted any results, but I know when it first came out, this was the card that people were worried about power level wise. You think of just like you windfall and then make 17 mana and cast all your rocks. that was the thing that people were worried about when these decks got spoiled.
Yeah, actually, I'm right there with you, Phoenix. I don't recall people, like screaming from the rooftops with worry about this card, but I do remember actually brewing occurring around this card. Before people kind of like became entirely fixated on Thrasios Tymna, you did see people playing Thrasios Kydel just as a straight blue-green deck, and that was actually, considered viable. And, I played against it at the time, and it felt like a totally fine deck. What you're getting there essentially is like kind of one card win conditions based on your secondary commander, being able to do all kinds of things with like, staff of domination, et cetera, et cetera. Kind of this like umbral mantle type of shell, which, at the time had tutor support for it. You could find all those artifact ways of making Kydel do the thing. And then you just had Thrasios in the command zone. So like it was a pretty coherent deck. And like Phoenix was saying, like people were absolutely thinking about it like right when these cards were spoiled. Spoiler alert, a lot of the things that we take for granted now were not immediately picked up on by the community. It actually took some time for us to come up with some of these, 4-color monstrosities. The sort of like really straightforward shell that I just described. Yeah, that was something that people picked up on really quickly. And it actually had some degree of success or at least some degree of presence.
And I think just for context, I think that this is the commander that Melissa and Gavin called out as one of the most powerful, other than
Thrasios and Tymna.
Well, actually, just skipping ahead before we got there, they thought that Tymna was perfectly fine and had no issues with Tymna at all. Was basically their opinion on Tymna, which some cEDH players may.
Yeah, well, I guess we'll get to that.
Disagree
right?
with, but
right.
We'll get there. But yeah, this was actually the one that they called out as maybe their opinion. This is like not okay as a commander because it is a mana dork. It interacts with drawing cards. It's generic. It's in blue-green. All things that you didn't need. At that point in Commander, it was blue-green and maybe a little bit of black, and that was the best 3 colors.
Right.
Yep. Yeah, blue-green, black at that point was by far the best 3-color combination that you could be playing. Obviously, like Grixis was still quite popular. Esper was very popular with Zur. But if you were doing anything kind of remotely mid-rangey, then yeah, like a lot of the time you were going to be playing that Sultai core. So yeah, I mean, it's true that Thrasios kind of just fit perfectly into at least the deck building ideas that were sort of du jour, right? Like the ones that we were our ideas of what the format was back then.
Right.
Yeah.
Not necessarily what the best decks were, right? Because you can't really say, but at least what the what the hive mind was doing, so to speak.
Right. It's interesting because it's one of those cards that I always feel like on paper should be really good. And then I try to do stuff with it and it just like never does what I want it to do. Which I think is kind of strange. But that's kind of Kydel in a nutshell. It's one of those cards that I also think definitely took a hit as it's when Paradox Engine got the axe, right? Like,
yeah, that changed things a lot, actually. A lot of this conversation, especially early on, and the way we were looking at decks back in that day, was heavily informed by the existence of Paradox Engine, and just that one card potential with Thrasios, right. The one card win condition potential. So after the banning of Paradox Engine, Thrasios decks at that point had kind of really established themselves, but then needed to kind of be, I would say, recreated, reborn, reimagined in a way.
Right.
And I would say that actually is sort of like one of the big turning points that brings us more into the modern era of what decks look like these days.
Yeah, for sure. Speaking of Thrasios, the next partner on our list is your favorite boy, your favorite merfolk, Thrasios Triton hero, costs a blue and a green, a merfolk wizard with the ability for 4 colorless, you scry 1, then reveal the top card of your library. If it's a land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped. Otherwise, draw a card. And it's a 1/3. Everybody knows this card. Everybody's aware of this card. And
what a nonsense card. Yeah.
Yeah. Like this was one of the cards they talked about where Gavin was just like, this card it is not
I
okay.
can jump in with a direct quote. So Gavin, so this card ended up, they talked about it later on in their video, ended up winning their Oops award, which they give for the card in the set that's an Oops. And so Gavin's quote on it was he actually created a motto for himself when he started designing sets, which was don't make more Thrasioses. Melissa's comment, which is pretty relevant to us, I think, is it's a cEDH staple, which probably is a really good sign that this card was a mistake.
Where's the
it's
lie?
not just a staple. Is there like a tier above staple? Like, I don't know. Feels like a format defining.
That's what I was about
staple.
to say. Yeah, this is very format defining.
But interesting anecdote about Thrasios, from someone who was there at the time. I can't name any names or anything like that, but I had gotten information about the sort of imminence of Thrasios being spoiled before it ever got spoiled by someone who knew things. And it was really interesting because even, to myself and maybe like some of the people I was talking with at the time who knew about this coming, we didn't even fully grasp the power of partner as a mechanic. Additionally, I think like our expectation was tempered a little bit by the fact that we didn't know what the partners were going to be. And I think that's like a major element of Thrasios's power.
Yeah.
But when I first heard about this card, I was like, oh, hey, that's really cool. That's going to be really strong very clearly because it's just an infinite mana outlet. But like, it's basically Tasigur, right? Like, and we had Tasigur, and Tasigur was not like changing. It was not like defining the format. It was not like the sort of like end all be all of commanders, in a way that Thrasios can be in a lot of situations, kind of centralizing a lot of archetypes around himself. And, it only sort of became clear as we saw the cards and we were playing with them that like, oh, Thrasios is not a 2-color commander. Thrasios is a 4-color commander. And like
this card is not
really
okay.
Changes the evaluation. This card is not okay. The only requiring colorless mana part, incredibly relevant. It's just an absurd card because it doesn't really do anything interesting. It just says pay 4 mana to get a Coiling Oracle effect. And it doesn't matter what your deck is, right? Like it's just do that. So, that was like another kind of funny thing or interesting thing that came up in the video from Melissa and Gavin. It's like they were both basically decrying how uninteresting this design was. And even some of these other designs as well for partners where it's like they don't push you in any particular direction.
Right.
Yeah. And like Commander, the identity of Commander before partners came out was largely about that. And they talk about, what's Phoenix, you'll correct me if I'm wrong here, but like what's the journey your commander is putting you on?
Or like
what's
a quest.
What's the quest? Thrasios doesn't put you on any quest at all other than
play the game,
infinite
play
mana.
lands.
Yeah. Like just make infinite colorless mana and that is your quest. That is antithetical to what the format was supposed to be, what it is depending on who you ask today, but kind of defined in many respects what it became after Thrasios.
Yeah,
it's interesting.
There was a lot of complaints
Go ahead.
in the video by Melissa, especially about how a lot of these decks are designed in a way to where the things that they want you to do is make mana and draw cards. And then the commanders make mana and draw cards.
Right.
Such as the two we just talked about. And none of that is interesting. None of it makes you do anything specific. Kaidel, that we just talked about, interacts with drawing cards, which you do by playing the game. You get one of those every turn. And so it's just none of these have any direction to pull you in, no goal. And Melissa mentioned this as well, which was the big issue with making the 4-color face commanders is that, especially Atraxa, just turned into keyword soup. And they're just kind of good stuff soup commanders. And then they were very excited about the partner idea because it gives you more identity in each card to kind of make a unique deck in 4 colors.
Right.
But then all the partner designs are generic nonsense, would be how I would put it nicely.
And one of the things that they did talk about that I really liked was Gavin talking about how when you design partner, they now have the understanding of you need to make the partner do like a very specific thing, like Malcolm, like it works with pirates or Arden, right? Like it's pushing you in a direction. Whereas Thrasios and Tymna literally can be anything, right? Like it was always funny because Max, otherwise known as Snacks, who is a friend of ours here in the community in our local EDH league, he would always bring Thrasios Tymna, but you would never know what deck he was playing that week because he could cycle it through whether it was Flash Hulk or Razakats or Paradox Scepter or all these, like he would, like he would always cycle it through. And so people would see it and be like, oh, I'm playing Flash Hulk. And nope, this week it was Razakats. And like that, I think that's kind of the problem where it's, for example, you see Arden, oh, I know exactly what I'm playing against. You see Malcolm, oh, I already have an idea of what to expect from this deck.
Yeah, and Melissa and Gavin even mentioned this, is that you see a Thrasios across the table. What are you playing against? I'm playing against a powerful card. That's
right.
Just what it is.
And I'm going to send this in our group chat to you guys, but I don't know if you remember this. So Gavin did say, I don't want to print any more Thrasioses and design any more Thrasioses, but don't forget that there are still new Thrasioses that they have made vis-a-vis my Thrasios alignment chart that I made, which I will put on the screen for the people, for the viewers. Zimone Quandrix Prodigy. Remember, if you remember when I made this, the rule is that they had to be a 2-color commander. In the exception, or a 2 CMC commander. In the exception to this was what was it? Tasigur, because Tasigur has Delve on it. And so I will lightly joke at Gavin. Hey, Gavin, you said you weren't going to make any more Thrasioses, and then you made more Thrasioses. All in jest. But moving on to the next deck, which is the Saskia deck, right? That is a commander that we totally play in cEDH for sure. But a partner that we definitely do play with in cEDH. You are probably very familiar with it. We just talked about it with Arden, is Tana the Bloodsower. She is a elf druid that costs 2 colorless, a red and a green. That's a 2/2 with trample. And whenever Tana deals combat damage to a player, create that many 1/1 green Saproling creature tokens. And I don't know if you guys listened to our episode last week that we did with Cobblepot, but I was that many years old when I realized Tana had trample. Because that's when I was like, oh, that's why you equip Colossus Hammer to her and just go to town on folks, because
the wheels turn.
Yeah, I was like, oh, okay. I never realized she had trample before. So, but of course, Tana, the iconic deck that you think of with this is obviously Blood Pod. That is like the Tana deck, right? Usually that people think of.
Yeah, especially early on, I would say. And to this day, I would say it's a deck that is very strongly tied to Tana, or Tana rather is very strongly tied to the deck, depending on how you want to look at it. Obviously since then Tana's been taking in new directions. And I'm sure we'll get to all of that, but very early on in the format, especially before Flash was unbanned, kind of at this time of these cards being released, Rule of Law kind of was maybe not as strong as it is now, but like was still incredibly powerful back then, and still kind of the best thing you could be doing stacks wise. So it made a lot of sense to be playing this Blood Pod deck that was really very focused on like the Rule of Law effects, but in addition, also the Blood Moon effects that were like much stronger back then, especially against kind of these new 4-color piles and stuff like that. So Tana kind of really supported that strategy in a way because she gave you like that scaling clock that we talk about. But what's really interesting now is that people are kind of taking Tana in like different directions. There's some situations where she's like utterly just for colors and really not at all a factor. And that's especially true for like the Sans Bleu like turbo style decks that are playing her. She's, I would say, not as much of an important element in like the sort of like Razaketh style versions of this deck. All that being said, she is a body and that'll always be at least somewhat relevant, and she produces more bodies. But then, kind of like what Callahan was alluding to, we've got like all these new sort of Tana decks where, she can either be relevant as like an Eldritch Evolution target, or else, you can like stick equipment on her and yeah, she has text.
Yeah,
I love
a reason
Arden
we don't call it
with Tana so much. It's so cool.
There's a reason we don't call the deck Tana Malcolm. It's called Teamer Malcolm.
Yeah.
Right. This is true. Yeah, we're definitely mostly using Tana for the colors there. That being said, I know that many builds of that deck play Niv Mizzet, so that's like one of the situations where you're going to use your Eldritch Evolution on your Tana to cheat in a Niv Mizzet.
Right.
There's other targets that you can conceivably Eldritch Evolution your Tana into, depending on the shell in question as well. It makes me think of like you like pass the butter meme, but like it's like you get sacrificed to Eldritch Evolution instead. Feels like it's somewhat applicable here. But yeah, Callahan, I mean, I'm interested in your thoughts about Tana with Arden.
It's honestly like outside of Arden and Kraum, I think it's like the most intriguing Arden companion. Just because of the fact that really once I made the connection that Arden or that Tana has trample, I was like, oh, that makes this insane. Because like we discussed in that episode where, I was the only one not playing Colossus Hammer with Arden. And that's because I don't want to take away flying from Kraum. And it was very interesting because like you definitely want to play Colossus. Like I think Arden Kraum or Arden Tana is like the closest you're gonna get to playing like Hammer Time in Modern in cEDH. Like honest to God, like it plays very similarly to that, and it's kind of really neat. And I like the direction that Cobble went with Arden Tana, and I like some of the things that Cicada has been doing with Arden Tana. And Cicada and I go back and forth. Like he and I obviously don't agree on everything. But like their deck is on the database, and I would absolutely recommend that deck to you if you want to play a deck that uses that both of your commanders are not only integral to your game plan, but serve a very like real threat in the game. And it's just like, if you want to play a stacks deck that you will feel like your commanders are not only impactful, but they have utility outside of being impactful, I would highly recommend checking out Arden Tana. I would also recommend checking out Arden Kraum. I think Arden Kraum and Arden Tana are both just like, for a long time, I felt like I'm sorry, I'm going to go on a tangent. Just bear with me. For a long time, I thought that like a lot of people kind of had this feeling that like Voltron style decks were like not really feasible in cEDH. And I think as we've explored Arden more, I think we started to realize that Arden makes it much more of a reality. And especially when you pair it with these two, you really see that, oh, you can really do some busted stuff with this card.
Yeah.
I have a 10-second tangent that before we move on to who. So just since we skipped over real quick, Saskia actually has the exact same problem as Vial Smasher, where you can name your single opponent in 1v1 and then it's just a damage doubler.
Right,
so
except that she's
the
4
same
colors
design
to
mistakes.
cast, right?
Yeah.
So
it's just kind of the
feel
same
like,
design mistakes repeating through this entire set.
Yeah, she's a lot less egregious there, though.
Oh, yeah.
I could maybe conceivably see her in like a Green Sun Zenith deck, right? Because then you don't actually have to pay that awkward mana cost. You can just pay 5 mana, and one of it, which is green, to get her into play. And then, she
has haste.
Gives everything double
6.
strike. She has haste. Yeah, exactly. She kind of, at that point, hits a little bit harder than Cauldron Complete. But like, are you going to be doing that in Legacy? Like, that's kind of the place you would be doing it. And it's just 5 mana. You know what I mean? It just doesn't really feel like anything particularly like good lines up with that. Plus, she's not even legal in like Modern or anything. So
yeah, you'd have to be doing it in Legacy, and like there's way better things you could be doing in Legacy.
It's just like a good 10-second tangent that like it's the exact same design mistake, and it just happened more than once in this set.
Yeah,
I think it's not so much that it's a design mistake. It becomes a design mistake.
Oversight, I think, is a better way.
Yes, it's an oversight, but I think it works absolutely fine in the case of Saskia. And where it becomes an issue is when you're talking about Vial Smasher, because Vial Smasher only costs 3 mana. That's a big one. Additionally, Vial Smasher doesn't need you to attack, which is like another element entirely. You can just be taking advantage of like free spells, like with alternate casting costs, and like the obvious way you build that deck, and you get a ton of free damage. So I don't know if it necessarily lines up to be the same from that design mistake perspective, but I get where you're coming from, Phoenix. Like it shows how subtle these things can be, where in one case it can be pretty flagrant, a pretty flagrant mistake, and in other cases it can be totally fine.
I think one of the things that I think is really interesting about this like era of these commander decks is you can definitely tell that the design team was learning a lot about the format through this design. And you can see that even in C17, that's the one that had Eminence, right? I believe that was the one that was the Eminence.
Or was
decks.
that C18?
I don't think it was C18.
Let me look.
I'm pretty sure
C17 does have Eminence. Yeah.
C17 was Eminence. Okay.
Because I distinctly remember I'm wearing my OU shirt today, my Ohio University shirt. I was living in Athens at the time when C17 came out. And so it's just very interesting because you could see how they learned those mistakes. Because like they made the same 1v1 mistake with a Rabo, where that was just like in 4-player, it's like not a big deal. But you look at it and then you put it into a 1v1 context and you're like, this card is insane in 1v1.
Yeah, actually bringing that up, you reminded me of like the whole sort of psychological progression of those decks, like from the consumer perspective, at least like from my memory, where you had like year after year, these decks that felt like absolutely busted, like breaking the rules of the format, really changing things up. And then at some point it was like a switch was flipped.
Yeah.
And it was like, oh, these are no longer nearly as compelling.
Right.
Or, I don't have the same anxiety about these sets being spoiled as I did in the past. So I think that really ties back to your point about how, yes, they were clearly learning things. They had to make the same mistakes a couple of times, perhaps, before they could really figure it out.
And the nice thing is, and I'll give them credit for this, is I think Commander can be pretty forgiving to design mistakes, if I'm being honest. I don't think making design mistakes in Commander is nearly as problematic as it is when you make design mistakes in competitive
Modern
and in Standard.
Yeah.
I don't think you feel them as heavily in Commander for a variety of reasons. In cEDH, I think the reason we wanted a card banned, it wasn't even a new card. It was an old card. Right. And so the design mistakes weren't even bad for the competitive metagame. Right. In fact, it probably
we love these design mistakes. They're our favorite cards.
Yeah. And so it's very,
I don't know if I fully agree, but
I love Partner personally, but it's interesting how Commander is one of those formats that can be really forgiving to fucking up effectively, right? You can have mistakes.
Well, I agree insofar for casual, you're 100% right. Where, if a card is too powerful, in many situations, people just don't play it because it's just uninteresting.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not always true either. Look at Golos, right? It's pretty clear that when a card is too generically good, at some point, and when a card is too generically good, that it kind of centralizes strategies around itself.
Mm-hmm.
At some point, the rules committee takes notice and takes action. The reasons why Golos was banned, if we were looking at it from a cEDH perspective, I feel could apply to a lot of the partners that we see.
I would agree with that.
Thrasios, Tymna, Kraum, insofar as they are pretty centralizing in similar ways. They kind of make it so that a lot of other options that you could consider, you might not consider. I don't know that I necessarily... clearly I don't disagree with you, right? I think that there's, especially in casual contexts, Commander is self-correcting, but not always.
Well, and I think here's my reasoning is, even if we banned stuff on the, I don't want to get into banned philosophy, but I think part of why I think Commander is more forgiving from a design perspective comes down to the fact that it's a 4-player game instead of a 1v1 game, honestly, because look at Oko, right? Oko in a 1v1 format was completely meta warping. Oko in a 4-player game is still really good, but it's not format defining. It doesn't change the format in such an egregious way that you have to take immediate action. And I think that's kind of what I'm getting at, is because of the multiplayer nature of Commander, you can kind of get away with some oopsie daisies because it self-corrects in the fact that 3 players will see one Cody deck sit down and everybody immediately goes, okay, we know who we have to deal with here right away. Right. Yeah. The whole table's on board. Whereas in 1v1, it's just you and you got to figure out what to do, and you won't always be able to do it. Whereas 3 people doing that, you're much more likely to be able to succeed in that. And I think that's where the multiplayer portion of Commander lets WotC kind of be experimental and kind of do different things, if that makes sense. that they might not be willing to take those same risks in like a standard format sort of thing is kind of what I'm getting at. If that makes sense.
I see where you're coming from. The example you brought up with Oko is really interesting because I actually think that it highlights how cards can actually be problematic in Commander along similar lines to why a card like Oko is problematic in 1v1. You know, if you look at how Oko operates in 1v1, Oko is oppressive and it gives you like a snowballing value that is almost impossible for your opponent to reverse course on, right? It's really hard for them to recover, to regain ground if you've had Oko active for a while. Now, obviously in 1v1, you know, you've got, as you highlighted, the resources of 3 opponents that can, you know, serve to sort of police you in that respect. But where that applies to a card like Oko, you know, and where, you know, Oko doesn't end up being oppressive in multiplayer because of that fact, you know, certain other cards can still operate. They can still have that play pattern in multiplayer where they invalidate your opponent's ability to stop you from having that snowballing value. And potentially building up an oppressive board state.
Well, and I think that was Hull Breacher, right? Like
that was Hull Breacher. I think that, you know, Golos as well. Prophet of Kruphix, probably like the best example of that.
Oh my gosh, dude! On Twitter, I've seen people who are newer cEDH players talking about how they should unban Prophet of Kruphix, and as somebody who played through Prophet of Kruphix, fucking no, that is you. Of all the cards on the ban list to unban, that would be like one of the very last I would even talk about. Like,
I mean, I think it's fine for cEDH, but no, like obviously you cannot have that card be legal in casual. It's like
we don't need another Seedborn Muse. That
card is nonsensical.
Better. Like the card is ridiculous.
Yeah. It's okay in cEDH the same way the Paradox engine is okay.
Right.
They're not coming off of the ban list.
But like a great example of something that was bad for cEDH, but was bad for everything else, and it's fine in 1v1 is Leovold, right? And we've seen how Leovold kind of was very promptly dealt with, and I think that's something that the rules committee does a really good job of. We've really gone on a tangent, but I don't care. It's good content.
We're avoiding the next one.
The next one's Ravos. Just so you know, we're saving the good ones for last. But like,
Ravos,
I mean,
2 words. It has not seen any play.
Has never seen play.
Never played.
But I mean, like, basically what I was trying to get at, my whole point by saying that Commander is a more forgiving format to make design mistakes for, is you can have these growing pains early on, like they did in C16 and C17 and, you know, previously, and it not destroy the format, right? Whereas you have these mistakes, you have the fire design, right? And it kind of ruined standard for a while, right? And you don't see that same amount of impact in Commander because of the multiplayer format, I think. And I think that's one of that's probably what attracts me to Commander the most, is that Commander is like that house that's built on like solid rock, that's always just like there and pretty, like has such a strong foundation that I feel very confident playing it all the time. And I don't have to worry about all of the sudden the format being unfun and unplayable.
I mean, counterexample to you is that if my only experience of Commander is going to my LGS and playing with the same 2 or 3 people,
it's true.
The person shows up with their Thrasios Tymna deck in our casual game, and they're the only person I can play with. It feels real bad.
Yeah.
For their Golos deck as a better example, probably.
That's true. That's very true. There's, and that's something that I think we wanted to talk with Max about at some point, is like local metas and how that plays into it. But that's a whole podcast unto itself. That's a whole
podcast episode. Yeah. That's a whole series.
Yeah, no kidding. Next card up on our list, like we said, is Ravos. Wow, fuck, I can't talk. Ravos Soultender. It's a 2/2 human cleric that costs 3 colorless, a white and a black. has flying. Other creatures you control get +1/+1, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you may return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. This is overcosted for what it does, and I don't think it has ever seen play outside of Jim from the Spike Feeders, specifically playing Ravos and Kaidel instead of Tymna Thrasios because he didn't want to play Tymna Thrasios. I think that's the only place I've ever seen it get play, ever.
Can I start with my hot take? I agree with Gavin and Melissa on their evaluation of this card. I think that it's almost undercosted for what it does. Unfortunately, what it does isn't anything we care about in CEDH.
Yeah.
+1/+1 to all your creatures isn't that big of a deal. And then the repeated, what's the effect called where you return the creature to the hand? There's a name for it.
I don't know. You return the creature to your hand. There you go.
Anyways.
That's what it's called.
Yeah, I like an Anthem plus flying plus a 2/2 body plus the return a card in your hand every turn plus you get an extra card in your command zone. The card's actually pretty powerful. It's just not broken.
Yeah.
So I actually have, I was joking earlier about how this
You're not
card,
joking. You're Pongo.
He's has never seen play, but that's actually a bit of a lie because, and this just goes to show like how bad we were at evaluating cards some time ago, and we're still bad, but like I like
slightly
a little bit better,
or slightly better,
but no, actually Ravos, people didn't immediately pick up on the fact that Tymna was substantially better than Ravos, and actually like Thrasios Ravos was kind of a thing for a very brief period of time, where people thought like, oh, Ravos is actually going to like lend itself to like some strategies where I might need to, do like the Raise Dead, like for a creature card, like Hermit Druid, for instance, or, just like some random other decks. So actually people did play Thrasios or Ravos, and those were eventually optimized into Thrasios Tymna when we realized that Tymna is
just strictly better.
Tymna. Yeah, so fun little anecdote there. But yeah, since that time we've kind of come to the realization that Ravos is overcosted and not really actually offering all that much in the way of real utility to cEDH decks. But yeah, like the earliest like kind of Boonweaver style ports into 4 colors, some of those too also played Ravos. Like, imagining Ravos as kind of being like Carador equivalent in a way.
That's wild.
I have another hot take too.
Okay. Give it.
It's not quite that hot.
Give it to me.
I think that there's maybe some interesting, so there's a lot of Exodus decks that a lot of people like to play. I think that there's some interesting decks that could use Ravos that do a very similar thing to Exodus.
Ravos Jessica or Ravos
pumps your Rograk.
Yeah. It does make your Rograk a 1/2.
I'm mostly joking. I know that Exodus is probably better than Ravos, but
I'm going to build it now just to spite you. Next card on the list is the woman, the myth, the legend, Tymna the Weaver. It's a 2/2 human cleric that costs 1 colorless, a white, and a black. Has lifelink, and at the beginning of your post-combat main phase, you may pay X life, where X is the number of opponents that were dealt combat damage this turn. If you do, draw X cards. And it's very interesting because Gavin really liked this card from a design standpoint, outside of the fact that it had partner. Like, if you took partner away, it's a very well-designed card. When you put partner onto it, that's when the card becomes insane, right?
Yeah, there's that. Also, at 3 mana, cards that are 3 mana and below are what we call kind of like pushed. I think that's the technical term. That's when they're efficient enough that they actually become potentially omnipresent or overly represented in more competitive settings. And so Tymna checks that box at 3 mana. And so that was another issue that they highlighted, and I think is probably the biggest issue with Tymna, even within cEDH. The design in terms of like the value that Tymna creates is not so disproportionate to what like more expensive commanders can do as well. But getting that in 4 colors and at that mana cost, where it's very conceivable to do that on turn 2,
Right.
Or even potentially turn 2 while still getting a draw trigger directly, kind of puts her into the problematic territory. So I'm gonna save the good stuff for Phoenix because I feel like I've talked a lot, but I'm just gonna say, my probably like ice cold hot take is that Tymna is the strongest partner.
Wow.
Above all.
What a take.
Yeah. you can tell me how many peppers or lack thereof that take is.
That's
no
so
peppers.
high on the Scoville scale.
Or am I full ice cube territory or is there just 0 peppers territory?
You're definitely 0 peppers territory.
Okay.
In my opinion. Yeah.
I think
Not a cold hot take.
I don't think it's an ice cube. I think it's like lukewarm. I think it's like room temperature. Because I think you could
That's
make some
warmer than
debate
I
about
expected.
Thrasios, and I think you could make some debate, some people might, about Kraum. And while I don't subscribe to the Kraum or the Thrasios like demographics of those debates, I do think there is some like debate about which one of them is the best. And I don't think it's a ice cold take to say that it's the best, but I do think it's a very safe take, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And so before I get too much into the history of Tymna, I'm going to jump into what Gavin and Melissa said about Tymna, which, as we said earlier, they started with their, okay, well, does this card have an identity? And it actually does. And I think Tymna is one of the ones that I'm the most okay with out of all of the commanders. It becomes generic, but it's not because of anything. Basically, the way that they set out on these, like on their evaluation of these, is that they ask, okay, well, what question or quest is this card asking me to answer? So for Tymna, it makes you want to go to combat and use the combat step. And that's not a bad thing to encourage. That's like really good. It's good for commander. It's good for it's
good for the
CEDH.
game to get people to attack.
It's good for the game to be in the combat step.
Yes.
The issue is that Tymna lets me start with 9 cards in my opening hand and then draw an absolute boatload of cards while I'm starting with 9 cards in my hand.
Yeah. That's like, I don't know, it feels like in retrospect, such an obvious point about partner that it's like so obviously problematic, or it's like, yes, I have the extra card in hand. And if any of my extra cards in hand give me extra cards, then that's just extra cards in hand.
Right.
Which is kind of just nonsense again. It's good when your commanders are giving you some consistency in the sense that, they're helping you through like a longer game, especially in more casual settings, where you've got kind of this expensive thing that you can play later on, and hopefully it's going to give you some options, kind of give you some staying power in a game, like in EDH, in a game that is, I would say, characterized very heavily by like a lot of attrition that can occur, like board wipes happening all the time, things that are going to be setting you back constantly after you build up. Being able to build back up after all of that happens is important, but having it be at like the right mana cost is kind of the important part. And so, Gavin and Melissa had mentioned that like Tymna at 4 mana would probably be how they would do it now. Yeah. They, as you said, Phoenix, they like the fact that like it gives you a bit of a build around direction, which is, probably with Tymna, you're going to want to be playing things that let you connect with all of your opponents, whether that's like evasive creatures or whether it's, things that pump up your creatures such that you're, more relatively advantaged in combat. or alternatively things that make your creatures unblockable or whatever. These are all things that you can do, I would say, in those colors alone, such that like Tymna could even be compelling without partner, and give you direction.
Mm-hmm.
But at 3 mana, it's a lot to draw 3 extra cards a turn to essentially just painful truths. And then on top of that, as soon as you start adding additional colors, Tymna quickly gets really, really problematic. Having just painful truths essentially in the command zone every turn. You quickly kind of begin to see how, other options sort of start getting totally pushed out for the type of decks that Tymna would be leading, which is decks that are featuring like lots of creatures, so like hate bear style decks. But even just then on top of that, even kind of like the Sans green decks, she has some inherent synergy with like, some of the kind of smaller creatures that you end up being able to play in those decks, especially nowadays. That I would say really just give those decks both the ability to be built for speed, but also just have like all this inherent resilience just because, in the command zone. So she's a major problem because like she provides resilience at an incredibly cheap mana cost. She provides that consistency of being able to just like have a turn 2 Tymna, for 3 mana. And then also, she lets you be in 4 colors, which means that you can be playing a completely commander agnostic strategy with like extremely high card quality, where you're not even necessarily reliant on actually casting Tymna, but you always have her there in case you need to.
I think perhaps this is a hot take. I think for when we're talking about these 2-color partner legends, I think Tymna would have been perfectly reasonable and fine had there not been like 4 other generic card draw engines that were
also printed as
in
partners.
opposite colors.
Printed as partners in opposite
Yeah,
colors.
as 2-color partners.
Like I think that's kind of the issue, in my opinion, is it's like I don't think the issue is Tymna herself. I think it's the fact that it's like Thrasios is what makes Tymna problematic. Kraum is what makes Tymna problematic. And it's just like
even Ludevic.
It's the I mean, even that in Kaidel, even like it's the compounding of the fact that there are like all these others that like just put you into generic 4-color territory that compound onto it. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think the design in itself, like Melissa said, is it gives you the quest of playing, attacking and doing those things. But even if you pair it with Kraum, right? Kraum's a generic draw engine. You pair it with Thrasios, it's a generic Kaidel, generic card, Ludevic even. And it's just like, it pushes you. It doesn't push you when paired with other 2-color commanders that open up your pool. It doesn't push you in any particular direction, right? It lets you do whatever you want.
I like largely disagree with that take. I mean, only insofar as I feel like Tymna is the problematic part of those pairings. But again, it's kind of like, what came first, the chicken or the egg sort of thing.
Right. They came out at the same time too.
They came out at the same time. But
would we have this? Would Tymna have been designed this way as like? Would it have been? We hold it as such like esteem if Kraum, Ludevic, Thrasios, and Kaidel also weren't just generic draws. Like if she was the only one of the partners, I don't think it would have been nearly as problematic if all of the other partners had like I think Ishai does a pretty good job of being not too super generic. Reyhan and Ikra kind of push you in a certain direction. Akiri pushes you in a certain direction. Like I think there are some of these that push you in a direction, but there's enough in the opposite colors that don't push you in a direction. That's kind of what I'm getting at. I feel like it's this compounding nature of it's just like you can just play a 4-color my commanders draw cards deck and then build whatever you want around that. Whereas if Tymna was the only one that was a generic sort of card like this, I don't think it would have been as problematic is kind of what I'm getting at.
Well, and I think the counterpoint to that is, you named Kraum and Thrasios, right? And that's all well and good because those are two very powerful commanders in their own right. But look at like Tymna Tana, right? Like who's doing the heavy lifting there? And also like what did the existence of Tymna Tana do to the like the stacks environment that existed in 2016, 2017? It kind of invalidated like a lot of other stacks decks.
And that's fair.
But even moving beyond that, like let's go back to the point that I raised when I was talking about Thrasios. Thrasios at sort of first glance, you look at it and you're like, okay, well, I mean, maybe this is a little bit better than Tasigur, but like maybe it's not because like Tasigur gives you back like a specific card, and that can be really relevant in like from a political perspective. But once you add on more than just black, okay, we're adding on white. That's interesting. Maybe now Thrasios is better because of that. You do Ravos and it's kind of like, okay, well, Ravos is kind of useless. Let's try out Tymna. We try out Tymna, and this is literally what happened to us back in 2016, 2017.
Yep.
We realized, whoa, it's the Tymna card that's actually nutty.
Right.
Because this is what's drawing me 3 extra cards a turn before my Thrasios even really, has text for the most part, other than being just a 1/3. Thrasios obviously ends up being good, if the game goes longer and longer and longer and your Tymna becomes somehow invalidated, right? That's always been an aspect of the card. But Tymna is the card, I would say, in that pairing that, especially in those days, before Tymna Kraum was really a thing and before we kind of optimized those shells with better win conditions and stuff like that, Tymna ended up warping the building, the construction of that deck. So we were playing more mana dorks instead of more mana rocks so that we could get more draws off of Tymna. And, we needed to draw into 2-card win conditions, right? And so it was just incredibly important to have Tymna, whether it was for Flash Hulk, right? Getting both Flash and Hulk, whether or not it was for, sculpting into counter magic so that we could just be getting enough counter magic to like resolve the Flash or like resolve the Scepter. It's just clear that drawing the 2 to 3 extra cards a turn for no mana was so much more central to those strategies and remains so much more central to those strategies than just 4 mana draw a card. To the extent that we like in a lot of these decks don't even play infinite mana combos anymore. Right? Like Thrasios literally is now just for colors in a lot of these decks.
It's wild thinking back to that time of Matt, because didn't Hulk get unbanned that summer?
Yes.
Yeah, like pretty shortly after.
Jesus Christ.
And it took
what a wild 6 months.
Decks too.
What a
and like
wild
you can also
6
follow
months.
exactly as we're going through these too, and like some of the history that Pongo's given. We as a community are great at finding win cons. We're not great at like figuring out what commanders are best or like evaluating cards, because you like even talking through these, you notice that all of a sudden, oh, these were the ones that came in the decks together. And then these are the pairs that we're playing together. And oh, wait, maybe I can optimize this a little bit and switch the commanders around.
Yeah.
We've gotten better as a community.
We've definitely improved.
Pretty clear. But yeah, still not amazing, right? Like it still takes time for ideas, I would say, to permeate the community. Somebody has like a good idea, and then, there's a little bit of, on the one hand, you could look at it as friction, but on the other hand, it could just be, people need to see it for themselves to believe it, sort of thing, right? It ends up being more friction-y because, like, on the one hand, you've got the people who have seen it and like very strongly believe in it, and they're like, well, like, believe me, I have seen it, but like other people haven't, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So like they still have to see it.
I.e. me yelling about Winds of Abandon for 6 months.
Well, but like, I think
Tymna Kraum is a great example because I remember I even made a
Tymna
Tymna
Kraum is
deck
the best example. Yeah.
that was like, we're playing Sarah Ascendant and Hate Bears. I don't know how we're going to win, but we're going to do stuff. And then like the commanders are really good, but the actual like 99 of the deck never really came together until people were like, oh, Breach is a good card.
Yeah, exactly. Breach is, a very recent poster child for that. But, this has been true pretty much, I think, as long as for as long as cEDH has existed. And I would go so far as to wager it's been true in like every hobby community ever, like as far back as you can go, short of like those like few very obvious cases of like, oh, like this is clearly the better thing, right? Like in our case, like when Thassa's Oracle was spoiled, it was like very easy, I think, for most people to grasp like what it meant. Well, you still had some people who were like,
I think it took people a while on Breach, though, right?
It took people longer on Breach. Yes, exactly. Because I think, it didn't have text that said you win the game.
Do you guys want to have a sobering thought? Just to kind of, as we're talking about, Theros Beyond Death, that set becomes 2 years old in like a couple weeks.
Oh, I had that thought when you said this set was 6 years old, and I was like, oh.
Yeah. It's wild because I always think like, oh man, C16 was really like 3 or 4 years ago. And then I looked at what the year was. I was like, no, it's about almost 6 years old. Shit. Before we move on to the next deck, Phoenix, I do want to say something because we are recording this today on Sunday the 16th. I don't know if you're watching any of the wild card football while we're recording. The Buccaneers are up over the Eagles 24-0 in the third quarter.
Well, sometimes you try your best and succeed.
I have never seen a team play so poorly. Absolutely hilarious. So for you sports fans out there, for our friends in Philly, we're sending our prayers and thoughts and prayers to our friends out in Philly. And I guess out to Boston as well, because the Patriots got demolished last night. But they
don't need any help. It's fine.
Yeah, they don't need help. They'll be fine. On to our next commander deck, which was Keanu Sentiro of Miletus. And this will forever. We talked about this in our Nico's Angel episode that we first did. It will forever bother me that Kianos and Tiro were not individual cards that had partner. It bothers the living hell out of me that you couldn't partner them together and they were one card. Not even a good card, even. So anyhow, Kianos and Tiro deck and the green-white commander partner from that is Sidar Kondo of Jamuraa. If you're unfamiliar with this card, he is a 2/5 human knight that costs 2 colorless, a green and a white, has the ability flanking, which if you're unfamiliar with this, get ready. I'm going to try and explain this to you. Whenever a creature without flanking blocks this creature, the blocking creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn. It was wild they brought that term, that keyword out of thin air for this one card that hadn't been used in like 15 some years. And
well, they actually talked about that on the in the review of Sidar Kondo. Was Jamuraa is on, gosh,
is it not on Dominaria?
It's on Dominaria.
I think so.
Because Jamuraa is that's
let me look.
Where Teferi's
it's on
from.
Dominaria, and then whichever set it was that Jamuraa was in and like featured in, flanking was the mechanic.
That makes sense.
Right.
That's kind of a neat nod. But he also has another ability that's less confusing. Creatures your opponents control without flying. Well, it's very, I'm not sure why they made this card. Creatures your opponents control without flying or reach can't block creatures with power 2 or less. This card is stupid. I have tried to use this card to make like Abzan decks before. And what it ends up doing is giving your opponents Tymna's, making your opponents Tymna's unblockable.
That's unfortunately exactly where my memory of the history of this card goes, is that everybody was like, wow, we can put this with Tymna and it makes Tymna unblockable. And then you play against Tymna and then Tymna's unblockable. And you're like, wow, that did exactly what I don't know what I expected.
Yeah. So actually there was like definitely some brewing around this card, I suppose you could say. I don't know if it's necessarily fair to call it brewing. You know, when Partners came out, you have to keep in mind and you have to remember that like one of the big decks of the day was Boon Weaver Carador. Mm-hmm. And everyone was like, oh, well, Carador is basically just like nothing in the command zone. You know, I guess you could say like the taste of oxygen in the command zone, to get referential here. So, you know, people kind of just said, oh, well, you know, I can port that deck into, you know, still in Abzan colors, Sidar, Tymna, right? And it's essentially the exact same deck, except now I've got a better commander. And then I've got this other commander who can make it so that, yeah, exactly, my little utility creatures and stuff like that I'm playing, my combo pieces can all swing in and draw me cards while I'm setting up my Boon Weaver combo. And then people even, you know, went on to do that with like Hulk as well when Hulk got unbanned. Even though, you know, there is a lot of compelling reasons to be playing Thrasios Tymna instead, i.e. Flash. But yeah, so there was a brief period of time where people were playing Sidar Kondo. And, you know, if I may go on a slight tangent here, there was a brief moment of time, I would say maybe a period of about 24 hours where people were trying to make Sidar Kondo a choice in cEDH. And I made sure to shut that down. Don't worry, everyone. Sidar Kondo's not coming for you.
It's just that meme of like the child sitting there and you just like your arms stretched out with all the arrows coming on your back, you taking all the hits.
Yeah.
or Sidar Kondo's just the dead horse, unfortunately.
Sidar Kondo's the dead horse. What?
Yeah. Oh, it's just the dead horse being beaten with a stick.
Oh,
and then,
yeah, sure.
Sidar Kondo's just on the horse while it's being beaten with a stick. That's all I was
mentioning. So yeah, people recently tried to make Sidar Kondo, featured in the command zone, and then unfortunately got optimized out. So a meme deck became a little bit better, and Sidar Kondo was unfortunately he was unfortunately caught in the crossfire.
Unfortunately, in quotation marks.
Yeah.
I think design-wise, though, for me, if every partner in this set of partners was like Sidar Kondo, we would be in a much better place.
Yeah. We would not be talking about them.
Yeah, I mean, his text is weird though, but yeah, it's unfortunate that it's symmetrical in a way. Because I definitely took advantage of that when I was playing against that Sidar Kondo
asymmetrical. Technically.
Yes, but loosely, right?
Yeah. They just don't attack you. They attack other people. And it's technically asymmetric, but you know, the whole 2/5 thing in play probably also contributed to them not attacking you. So
it's also weird that the card with evasion on it gives your creatures evasion and it has flanking, and it's like, what?
Yeah. It's just a very odd
that's
card.
true, right? I mean, it does mean that I don't know. I guess you could pump this is what it means, and then get the ability.
I mean, it's like something with flying a reach block this and it doesn't kill it, I guess. Well, but it's just really weird.
Yeah, you'll have a potential easier time killing their creature if it has flying or reach and it blocks your Sidar Kondo.
It's so strange, the design of this card. Onto another interestingly designed card is Ludevic Necro-Alchemist, which recently became a standard sort of card as he was printed into, Innistrad, was it the moon one?
Oh yeah, Crimson Vow,
Eldritch Moon.
Was it?
That's the wrong set. But
We're talking
Midnight
more
Hunt?
recently.
Yeah, he was recently.
Midnight Hunt
It
was the one with the moon symbol, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, the one with the werewolves. Anyhow, I'm really bad at keeping up with the names of anything. Anyhow, Ludevic is a 1/4 human wizard who costs 1 colorless, a blue, and a red, and says at the beginning of each player's end step, that player may draw a card if a player other than you lost life this turn. So it's not like, it's actually not a terrible design, in my opinion. I actually think it's like...
It's an Edric.
Yeah, it's an Edric
sort of.
In a way
Kind of.
that encourages people to like not attack you, and also can... It's a 1/4. Like, I kind of forgot that this card has a big ass. Like...
Well, it encourages people to send at least one attacker somewhere else, right? Like,
right.
That's all it encourages. They can send everything else at you.
Right. It's just very
interesting. It's a failure of a card. It's a major failure of a card.
Yeah.
Because why does Ludevic do that? Like, you see him like building a zombie. Like, in what universe does he care about drawing cards for, like, you know,
Why
people
couldn't this
losing
be
life?
Kenios or Tiro, and then Ludevic is the face commander for this deck. I don't know, or why that wouldn't make much sense. But like, you know what I mean? Like,
he shouldn't have been in the Sans black deck either, probably, because like, if
neither should have
anything,
Kraum. It made no sense.
If
Like,
anything, it feels like he should have been in the Gidris deck.
yeah.
And then like somebody from that, I mean, you would have to shift a lot of things around, right?
yeah.
But like, it feels like you could do something much more interesting and kind of chaotic and experimental with him in the Chaos deck.
Right.
And, you know, in what universe is like this character from Innistrad, you know, fitting in alongside Kenios and Tiro in like the group hug deck?
Right. The other thing that's so bizarre, like, I get where like the ability is like a kind of a group huggy sort of ability, but here's my biggest issue, and I think Phoenix kind of hinted at it, is like, this doesn't make any sense to A, the like lore of who he is, or B, what's actually happening on the card, right? Like, he's building Kraum. Like, why is it not a sort of like grafting sort of card, right? Like,
Yeah.
they got it with the new Ludevic. The new Ludevic kind of gets understood the assignment, but this just kind of I think this kind of points to, I think even more than Thrasios and Tymna and Kraum in a way, of how for whatever reason, when they were designing these cards, there was a like clear emphasis on like generic designs. You know what I mean? Because like this card could have been designed completely differently, just looking at the card art and who Ludevic is and what was kind of going on.
It felt like a bottom up design is what you're saying, where they just ended up slapping on Ludevic's name instead of starting from the name and designing top down.
Yeah, and Gavin and Melissa even commented on this, is that like the 4-color commanders kind of limit you a lot and become very soupy just because you need to get enough out of the 4 colors and each color adds something to the card.
Mm-hmm.
And then the way that they talked about it, at least from their knowledge of it, is that partner came in as like okay, well, this is how we get more 4-color cards that aren't soupy. But then every partner we got was very generic instead of being like the newer partners that they like a lot more, where it's like, okay, well, this is a pirate card, or this is a X card, or a Y card, or whatever.
Right. And I think
I agree. I was just going to add, you know, I feel like some of the commanders ended up being a better success from the stated design goal of like designing these cards around what they're missing, the color that they're missing, as opposed to the colors that they have. Right. I think the face commander here, Kenios and Tiro, do a fantastic job of that because they're missing the parasitism of black. that's like what they're missing. And so it's a group hug commander and they have a group hug ability. And, that's good design from that, setting out from the perspective of like, let's do the thing that these colors are missing. I think Saskia is also particularly good for this. Idris maybe is a bit weaker, just because it feels like a little generic and it, kind of doesn't really feel like it's missing white. It feels like you could just do that on like a teamer card or something. But yeah, I feel like returning to Ludevic, and to your point, Callahan, some of these cards feel, and I don't want to be mean or anything, but like somewhat phoned in, where it's like, oh, we have like this list of things that we need to do. And we're lacking inspiration in certain places.
We need X partners and we have a blue-red one that's left. What does blue-red do? Draws cards?
Yeah,
it's just they could have done so many things with this.
And the kids have been asking for Ludevic, so we got to give them Ludevic,
Like, it just... Kraum being what Kraum is, I'm okay with, honestly. But Ludevic, I'm actually more mad about. Because it's just such a... This is such a, like, milquetoast sort of card. Because it, like you said, it feels very phoned in. It doesn't feel like it has any flavor. It doesn't feel like it makes sense. It's just, here's a draw ability and here you go. It's 1/4. And like,
and it's group huggy.
Yeah. It feels so phoned in.
This would have been fine if it was just like, some new character that we didn't particularly care about. Right. Yeah, with like some no real backstory to speak of, but yeah, obviously you have
Ludevic's like a big character in Innistrad.
Yeah,
like it doesn't have it's just like we were just talking about Sidar having a mechanic from the original Dominaria era.
This has nothing.
This doesn't have an Innistrad mechanic. 100%. It has nothing to do with it.
Yeah,
right. It's so strange.
Right, Phoenix.
I will be grumpy about this.
He did
card
bring
forever.
us one good thing, though.
He did bring us one thing, which is his Opus, Kraum, Ludevic's Opus. And Kraum is a 4/4 zombie horror that costs 3 colorless, a blue and a red, and has flying haste. It also says whenever an opponent casts their second spell each turn, draw a card. If you're unfamiliar with this card, welcome to hell. So this card is... A lot of people, there's a lot of debate in the community, obviously, which is better, Thrasios, Kraum, Tymna. Kraum has definitely earned its spot. I would say, like, of the generic, like, commanders, on paper, just looking at this one, this is, like, the most intimidating one on paper, if that makes sense. Because it's a big
like
body.
Stats-wise? Yeah.
Yeah, like, stats-wise. Like, it's a big body with haste that
Ikra,
also draws cards. Like,
and flying, yeah.
Yeah.
He's evasive. He's getting in. He's crunching in.
Right. But when we actually look at
one
this,
thing that if just jumping in on talking about what Pongo was just talking about with the colors that you're missing, is this one also doesn't really make sense in this color combo because it feels like it's the second spell a turn punishing.
Feels like
so
a white
like,
spell.
It's kind of a white card, or maybe it's supposed to be anti-white. White kind of has started now getting this like second spell, you get a thing mechanic. But at this point in time, there weren't any of those cards really. Right. And at this point in time, this card definitely felt like it lacked white.
Well, Phoenix, I think you're 100% right. But, another way to articulate that is that as a blue-red card, this should say when you cast your second spell for the turn, you draw a card.
Yeah.
Right? Because that's what blue-red wants to be doing. like, since when does blue-red care about, like, my opponents are casting their second spell?
Yeah, we have 2 group huggy or like I care about my opponent's blue-red spells, and that is not blue-red.
At least not historically. And since then, not really. So Kraum, I think, largely stands alone in that respect. Obviously within the context of group hug, you're giving people more mana, you're giving people more cards. So it makes sense that they're going to be casting additional spells, and this is a way to cash in on that. So it works. It doesn't feel particularly blue-red other than like the haste, right, for the red, and like the card draw for the blue. But like, yeah, I don't know. I think that all that aside, it's a reasonably well-designed card. At 5 mana, you know, having a fairly strong ability, that's a good place for, I think, a partner to be. On its own, it's not enough, right? It compared to, at least in my opinion, something like a Tymna, something like a Thrasios, and, you know, even Thrasios, I think, doesn't even, at least in my estimation, doesn't quite measure up to Tymna in this regard. You know, it doesn't feel like a full card. Which is not to say Kraum is not good, because obviously Kraum is very good, but like it feels like he needs the support of another commander who's doing something, you know, who's either providing him more colors or providing you a little bit more direction, to really make best use of his power.
I mean, not to be the Lavinia person, but again, where I just harp on something that I really like. But I mean, Arden is, I think, a good example of that, where Arden gives Kraum like some sort of like, okay, here's a purpose for what you're doing. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Because like even just like the ramp into Kraum and play Kraum, and like, you know, I mulliganed for that. That game plan, you know, while sure, you know, it works in some metagames, I think it's safe to say it works less well now that, you know, stacks has sort of become a much stronger component in the metagame.
Yeah.
But additionally also like mid-range has kind of made a resurgence to some degree.
Thanks, Winota.
Yeah. So these are strategies that I think are more able to, especially early on, play this game plan of, you know, 1 spell per turn, developing Mana Dork turn 1, developing some kind of engine turn 2, and then like, you know, just holding up interaction as well. So Kraum loses some potency, you know, under those play patterns. I don't really feel that like Kraum in like the Kraum Tymna pairing is the card that makes that deck the deck that it is, you know, as absurd as it is. It really is largely on Tymna's, you know, very capable shoulders. You know, Kraum has 2 heads. There's just not enough space for his shoulders there to really support everything that the deck's doing. But
checkmate, liberals.
Checkmate. Yeah, so that's it. You know, Kraum, again, like, it is a very good card. When he's at his best, he's quite good. I think when he's doing his thing, but you know, like on his own, and you know, you see that especially when you're looking, I think, at like Kraum Ikra, for instance, having played that deck in the MLC and also just a little bit in general, like you kind of just feel like you don't really have
much to do,
much of a command zone. Yeah. Like Kraum is good, but not good enough without Tymna.
The thing about Kraum, I think that I'm most frustrated with the more we talk about this like deck and these decks and their design, is it's not even internally synergistic with the 4-color pairing of Sidar. Like,
yeah, we were talking about that.
It actually kind of hurts my head now. Like I'm looking at this and I'm looking at Sidar next to it, and I'm like, these two as a partner pairing make absolutely no sense.
Yeah, there's like weird. I mean, Kraum has flying, so he already has the evasion, right? But like it's true that it kind of feels like this deck is like being pulled in a few different directions as a result of that, and that's kind of like what we were talking about before.
This is, for context, this is the lowest rated deck that minimalists have looked at. So far. It's very
interesting because, like, I think we look back at C16 as being like this amazing commander set, And it was because it gave us like these partners and it like changed a lot of stuff. But when you actually look at the decks, they're actually kind of bad.
This specific deck, just a tangent for a little bit, this specific deck is a lot of in my opinion, this specific deck is a lot of the problem that people have with pre-con games.
Yeah.
This deck played Propaganda, Ghostly Prison, Sphere of Safety.
Yeah.
All in the same deck. Didn't really have a way to win the game and just made everyone draw cards and make mana. It just didn't do anything other than slow the game down.
Blazing Archon in play and creatures can't attack you, and then you put a Progenitor Mimic on your Blazing Archon, and eventually, 30 turns later, no one can actually do anything about your board, and you win, right? Like,
yeah,
because these decks are not particularly well built to deal with that kind of thing.
Yeah. And then the Yidris deck basically didn't work unless this one was at the table. I mean, it's really weird how these decks kind of just didn't work.
And you also kind of saw that with Commander 2020, I think, a little bit. Because wasn't that the one that you like got all the decks for? And you, me, Hodge, and Max got together and played them. And I was playing I believe it was the Savine deck. Or was that C? Yeah, that was C19.
I think it was 2020. C19 maybe. Yeah, it was the ones with the free commander spells and the will spells, I think.
No, it was the one before that because it was the one with Savine. Because Gavi was
in there.
Gavi was it was the one with Dockside. But anyway, like I was playing the Savine deck, and I'm playing this deck, and I think you were playing the Naya one. And
I was playing Anya, I think.
Were you?
Yeah,
I don't remember. Whoever was playing the Naya one won the game because they were the only one that could do anything. Because like I'm sitting there with the Savine's deck attempting to, I don't even know, because it had no way to close the game at all in the deck.
Board wiped.
What'd you say?
It just board wiped.
Yeah, it literally had like seven.
The black red deck board wipes.
Yeah.
And then the morph deck sat there being like, stop board wiping. And then the green white deck was like, well, I'm just going to continue making 4/4s.
Yeah. I think that's one of the things that I think they've gotten better at in recent years with the commander decks of making them like more playable with each other. But that's
these decks have plenty of problems when playing against each other. And I think that these decks were so popular that they definitely created that stigma towards pre-con games.
I would definitely agree with that.
At least in my knowledge, these 5 decks, the way that they played together was not great. And that is where a lot of people have a lot of issues with pre-cons.
Yeah.
Just as my random tangent.
Phoenix and I did talk about this actually fairly frequently.
Yeah.
I do think that all of the decks individually, none of them are that bad. It's these 5 decks playing against each other is not almost ever a good pod.
I don't know that I totally agree with you that they're all not that bad. I think the Canacentero deck is like actually a disaster of a deck.
Yeah, I think the Atraxa deck's actually pretty good.
The Atraxa deck's pretty fine, but like I specifically remember buying the Canacentero deck because I will never forget they had at my local Walmart when these came out. All of these like on clearance for some reason, but they were the Japanese versions. And I bought like 2 of each deck and was just like, hell yeah. I don't even care. I believe our local game store still has the Tymna I sold to them. That's Japanese Tymna that nobody wants because it's a Japanese Tymna. Maybe I'll buy it back. Who knows? But that moves us on to, speaking of Atraxa, the Atraxa deck. And this was a deck that they rated pretty highly. I kind of tend to agree with them. And I think the partners actually work together in a synergistic way and have a theme. Wow. Weird. Imagine. In the first partner on our list here is Ishai, Ojutai, Dragonspeaker. And you're probably familiar with this card. Being played with such great hits as Jeska and Tevish Zot. But if you're unfamiliar and you're not Nathan Jones or Phoenix or Cicada, what Ishai does is it's a 1/1 bird monk that is 2 colorless, a white and a blue, has flying, and it says whenever an opponent casts a spell, put a +1/+1 counter on Ishai, Ojutai, Dragonspeaker. I love this card so much. Phoenix can vouch for this. I have been saying for a while that, like, I think there is a 4-color Ishai, like, Reyhan deck that is totally playable out there somewhere that that can be built, just nobody's built it. That is something I have firmly believed for years.
I've heard this before.
What?
I've heard this before.
Phoenix has heard this rant many times. I haven't tried to build it because I don't like playing with counters most of the time, but I do think it exists. So if you're out there and you're listening, you should try like Reyhan Ishai. I think there's a deck there. Anyway, thoughts on Ishai?
I can start on this one since I've played some Ishai. Ishai, I'm trying to think. Historically, I don't remember anything very specifically with Ishai. I think cEDH as a whole kind of hit this one on the head that it's just a little bit slow. Mm-hmm. So Mana Gorger, Hydra style effects are generally just a little bit slow in multiplayer. And Jeska is definitely a big push in the making it not quite so slow, being at 7 cards casted. Melissa and Gavin talked about my dislike of this card as well, with the same things that they didn't like, where they talked about the card. Melissa was like, yeah, this seems like a great card. Mana Gorger Hydra is fine in multiplayer. And then Gavin was like, well, also think about having to play against this every game. And then it always comes out and you always get punished for playing your own spells. Mm-hmm. And that just doesn't feel good. And that's kind of my issue with Ishai. cEDH context, it's just a little bit slow most of the time.
The nice thing I will say about Ishai is that Jeweled Lotus definitely made Ishai stocks go way up, because it went from being like turn 2 to 3, like 3 at the latest, right? To you could very easily drop this on turn 1.
Yeah, absolutely. Pongo, do you remember any decks with Ishai? I really don't.
Before Commander Legends.
I'm trying to think of anything before Commander Legends that like had any traction.
Yeah, so I don't really think that Ishai saw a ton of play, perhaps other than like Ishai Tymna, which some people were doing, kind of just like as like an Esper Tymna deck.
Esper.
Yeah. I know Sick was playing that deck for a while, and I actually haven't seen him play that in, probably over a year now. Basically the idea being that, you're just going to play extra turn spells, hit people with a big Ishai and be drawing cards with your Tymna, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, I mean, no, I don't think Ishai really saw all that much play until Jeska really hit the scene. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of gotten people looking at Ishai again in other contexts, but it really took people having, like, I would say, sort of like the best shell, at least in my opinion, for Ishai, before that amount of experience got them thinking about doing it elsewhere.
And this is something I think is interesting. I've been talking about this, and because this is a deck that Adam from what's it called, Casually Competitive, plays Jeska Ishai, but plays it a lot. Doesn't play it like Nathan Jones, the Hermit Druids deck, but instead plays it a lot closer to my Arden deck. And that's kind of one of the things I've said is I think Ishai definitely is good in like a control-y type deck, because it incentivizes your opponents to like not do stuff. And then it gives you like a punishing thing so that if they do stuff, you have something to punish them with. And that's why I really like seeing Ishai and like these control style shells. Like when I see people building Jeska Ishai as a control deck, not a breach deck, I think it's really interesting. And I think that that's a great fit for it. We talked about that a little bit, I think, in the when we did our tier list series, where I think people have just been playing like Jeskai wrong for a really long time. And I think Ishai is like kind of a commander that pushes you if you're in Jeskai to play it in a more like control-y shell. Like it definitely does a lot better there. But I also like seeing it with Tevish, honestly. Like I think that's a really neat combo, and the Academy Rector combo that you can do with it is just so good. Chef's kiss. I love it.
We love our humilities around here.
Except the problem is every time I've seen you get a humility, you haven't had anything to defend your humility with.
Yeah.
So it's been like you've been immediately punished.
It's the life and death of humility players. Maybe they should have been more humble.
Don't play any creatures in my deck that turns off creatures, and all of a sudden I get killed by random creatures.
Yeah.
That's bizarre.
Here come the 1/1s.
Next card on our list is Reyhan, Last of the Abzan. Reyhan is a 0/0 legendary human warrior who costs 1 colorless, a black and a green. And it says Reyhan enters the battlefield with 3 +1/+1 counters on it. Whenever a creature you control dies or is put into the command zone, if it had 1 or more +1/+1 counters on it, you may put that many +1/+1 counters on target creature. It's kind of like the Ozolith almost. So
do we know if this still works with Exile? I think it does, right?
I don't know for sure. I don't know if it does. I have hold on.
They talked about if they need to do errata this on the show, so that's the context.
What is the current text on it?
I'm looking at the Oracle text. Y'all keep talking, and I'll find you an answer.
Yeah, Reyhan is a extremely reasonable card. You can see it, and you're like, wow, I could do some interesting or fun things with that. And you kind of think about what you want to do with it. It sends you, like they were saying, it sends you on a quest of doing stuff with 1/1 counters and making my creatures bigger. And it gives you more 1/1 counters when your creatures die. It just, another one of the ones that I would be like, if every partner was like Reyhan, I would have been way happier with partner.
Yeah.
I don't believe you do the counters if it gets exiled.
Yes.
The way it's worded, they have it errated. So because it does say dies or goes to the command zone. So I think it's either that or that replacement effect specifically.
So I'm unsure. We could probably ping it.
I mean,
I feel pretty confident in ruling it that way as a judge.
The information, when it goes to exile and then to the command zone, that it had the counters
technically,
on it?
if it goes to exile, there is technically an option before it would go to exile. If you exile if you path to exile something, there's technically upon resolution of the spell or the resolution of like state-based actions, that's where you make it because it never actually hits exile before
you replace the exile.
Yeah, you replace that exile by putting it in the command zone.
So it's not like hitting the graveyard then.
So it still works.
No, yeah. It never. Okay. So like if you, this is one of the interesting things with Child of Alara, right? Where Child of Alara, if you put it in the command zone when it dies, it doesn't trigger Child of Alara. Because it never hits the graveyard.
It does now,
right? It does now. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. That was what was changed, and I was just uncertain whether or not that
work that way with exile.
It doesn't work that way with exile. Right. Exactly. So then it doesn't need to be errated.
Yeah.
It still works.
So it works fine.
I mean, did you have anything in particular you wanted to say about Reyhan Phoenix? No, shaking his head.
No, not really. I mean, I kind of went on my spiel to I think Reyhan's completely reasonable. If we had more Reyhans in the world, I would be happy about it.
Yeah, power level wise, very, very reasonable. There was kind of a somewhat gimmicky deck with Reyhan. It was a Reyhan food chain deck that you would play with Reyhan and Kraum. And the goal was to make just, your infinitely large Kraum that you could then punch people. You could also make a couple of other things infinitely large as well.
That's hilarious.
Again, pretty gimmicky. The only other thing about Reyhan that occasionally crops up in conversations is, if you were going to build a Sans White sort of turbo-y deck, what is the best black-green commander to pair with your Kraum? Is it Reyhan or is it this next one that we're going to talk about? Reyhan being a 3-mana 3/3 that does nothing.
Ikra?
Yeah, or the next one we're going to talk about being Ikra. Reyhan being a 3-mana 3/3 that does nothing is that better than a 5 mana
card that does nothing?
3/7 or 3/7 that
does things,
maybe does nothing, or maybe it does something really busted. I guess that remains to be seen in the conversation.
I think Reyhan has been criminally underexplored in Magic, personally, or in cEDH. I think
he's just so fair and reasonable.
Yeah.
What does Reyhan do that makes him compelling to play?
For me, it is, I think there is the fact that there is like
Just make stuff big.
But that involves your Reyhan like dying multiple times. Like,
I mean, not necessarily.
Yeah.
I mean, like, to me, I look to a deck like Hardened Scales in Modern, and I would immediately be like, I feel like that's like the template. And I feel like there is definitely something there. Again, as I said earlier, with like Reyhan Ishai sort of things, I'm just like, I don't know if I want to brew it. Maybe I will take up that mantle and start brewing it because I'm defiant. But I think that like these sorts of strategies have just been written off instead of explored. And or done in a way that's like gimmicky instead of actually trying to find like a good strategy for it. And I think especially now with the new partners, you could absolutely build something interesting with Reyhan, in my opinion.
I mean, Reyhan Ishai is it's the winning combination of not playing red cards, not playing Thrasios, and not playing Tymna.
Not playing Tymna.
Yeah.
That's why.
Yeah, I recognize why.
Now I just want to make my Rogue Rack pumped with the Reyhan.
That actually is
you can tell what's on my mind right now. It's pumping Rogue Rack.
That would actually be kind of fun. Moving on, like we said, to Ikra Shidiqi, the Usurper. Ikra is a 3/7 Naga wizard that it costs 3 colorless, a black and a green, has menace. I just dropped my thing. Don't mind me. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you gain life equal to that creature's toughness. And if you notice, Ikra has menace and a big booty. So
long butt.
This is, yeah. So this is kind of where you were getting, where there's always kind of been this little debate about whether you should play Ikra or whether you should play Reyhan. And Pongo, as somebody who's played that deck in the MLC and kind of has some experience piloting, like what do you think about Ikra in this sense?
Spleenface is wrong. You play Ikra, don't play Reyhan. Like, it simply put. I understand the argument that, if you look at the commander, the black-green commander in your Sans White deck as being a do-nothing, then sure, like a 3-mana do-nothing is better. But, I have played games, and this even came up in the MLC, where like using Ikra is actually relevant. Ikra is not a do-nothing. My deck is essentially just mana sources. So like a 5-drop is not that much like harder to sell than a 3-drop. But also this one is gonna like actually make my ad nauseum like stay relevant into the late game.
Right.
This one, you know what I mean? This one could potentially just hang back and block because it has 7 toughness for some reason. These are all pretty relevant things. And this is, it's relevant enough that we've even seen like bad farm, right? Like a Tymna, an Abzan Tymna turbo deck, which, you could make an even stronger argument in favor of just wanting a 3-drop in the command zone, because then you've got a 3-drop that you can attack with. It comes down potentially a little bit sooner.
And that might also pump your other creatures that you're playing a lot of, right?
Yeah,
like,
conceivably. But like you still play Ikra because like the ability to have staying power in a longer game is not irrelevant. And you can also use it to synergize with certain cards that black and green give you, like Sylvan Library or Necropotence, for instance, making those cards last longer. you're essentially looking at it like a Turbo Nas deck where you're trading the power of some of those white cards like Tymna, like Silence, like Ranger Captain, et cetera, and instead you're getting the ability to play, some of the things that green is kind of famous for, and like green-black decks are famous for, which is just being a more resilient deck, being a more, in some ways, like not necessarily consistent, but like able to play a longer game, and to be able to leverage certain tools that will improve your consistency. And so
I hate you all. You're gonna make me make a hardened scales deck. You're gonna make me brew this goddamn deck. I hate it.
I don't think Ikra is a fantastic commander. Like I don't want to oversell her, but I think she brings more to the table than Reyhan, and I wouldn't say that she's underrated or anything like that. I think she's perfectly rated by most people.
Perfectly rated.
She's. You would, I think, replace her for a black-green commander that did something pretty quickly. But, the thing that she does at least is, it at least does come up for those decks that you could want that effect. And so, she's fine. And I think it's kind of a weird design, but and that's kind of something that Gavin and Melissa talk about, how she's weird. But I also think they kind of miss out on the fact that they just released a set recently where the limited theme was black-green toughness, right? Mm-hmm. So it seems like black-green toughness actually is a theme, and they've extended it into Abzan as well, and that's kind of like what we see here. But
the problem with that is Ikra's Soultender.
Yes,
Ikra's
but that's
not
fine. She's black-green here.
This hurts my head so bad.
She's part of the Soultender clan.
Yeah.
But that's fine. What she does is black-green. Her text is all black-green.
She's literally Soultender.
Yeah. But
hence the Usurper.
Yeah.
And the zombie.
I think though that just being black-green is kind of acceptable for her card design.
Yeah.
She's a partner, so you could conceivably give her blue, right? And even in this deck, right, she is a 4-color with blue, as well as white commander. So, I think all of that mostly checks out, at least along the lines you would expect it to. And it fits well with that theme that I was talking, or that idea that I was talking about before, which is, the Sans red deck. What do you expect it to be? You expect it to be the deck that outlasts, right? Because what is red trying to do? Red is trying to win aggressively, fast. And this is the deck that's going to just go over the top of all of that. It's consistent from that perspective. The entire deck is incredibly, I would say, well designed.
The Atraxa deck is just a good deck.
Yeah, it's well
out of the
designed,
box, good and well playable.
It's well designed along, the sort of initial conceit that I talked about, which is the Sans red idea. I think proliferate is a really nice way to do that, because it is literally begging you to extend the game for it to be meaningful. And what we were talking about before, where this deck got high ratings, the deck has a lot of good internal consistency. All the cards seem to play well to that plan. The only thing that really stands out about this deck that, is maybe, depending on how you want to look at it, it could be a flaw, but it could also be a strength, is that for a precon, this literally has an infinite combo in it.
That's true.
Which I don't know if that's a plus or a negative. I think
that's better than the last one that that literally didn't have a way to win the game.
Oh, I agree. I'm in the same boat as you.
That's how I feel about it. Give me the combo.
A 3-card infinite combo. Yeah, absolutely.
Give me a way to win the game.
For anyone wondering, it's Cathar's Crusade with Gave and Crystalline Crawler, which lets you make infinite little whatchamacallit, sapling tokens. Yeah, but they're not even 1/1s. They get pretty big because of Cathar's Crusade too.
So one of the things though that I really like about this deck, and again to further juxtapose it against the last one, is just looking at the partners. The things we in cEDH really care about is the partners make sense together.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Whereas like the last deck, the partners made no sense together at all. Like you put Ludevic with Sidar or Kraum with Sidar, and like they don't make a whole lot of sense at all. Whereas you put Ikra or Reyhan with Ishai, and like they make sense. They look synergistic. They look like they were meant to be together in like that shell. You know what I mean? And I think that's like, and I think this is the first of all of them that I actually feel that way about, where you can look at the partners and go, these were meant to be played together.
Yeah, and I think other than like a couple minor dings that I would give the partners in this deck for design things, if all the partners were on par or like similar to the 3 partners in this deck, I don't think we would be here having this exact conversation.
I think I agree with that too. I was thinking something similar because these are all like very reasonable cards, right? Like
they all do something at least somewhat interesting. I mean, the green-black ones are kind of do nothings in their own unique way, but
they do something, but
you're pumping things, doing counters, you're gaining life. I mean, they're all using parts of the game, like Ikra is using the combat step. I mean, it's all things that we've given pluses to the other cards for.
I think if we didn't have so many other generic partners, we would have thought of these as really interesting. But because we had all these generic ones that didn't require us to build around, we look at these as do nothings because we have those generic ones that we want to just build like these base decks around. And then we just look for commanders that draw us cards or something. So if it doesn't fit into that like mold of it gives me advantage in this way, it doesn't do anything. Right. Whereas Ikra does do something. Reyhan does do something. Vial Smasher does do something. It's just because we have all those other generic ones, we now look at the ones that like this that does something. You know, you could have built a deck around this theme, right? And so it's just like and again, this goes back to the fact that like Tymna, Kraum, Thrasios are all mistakes. Like, they should not exist.
Yeah.
They're one
not
thing though.
Irredeemable. Like they're not irredeemable. Like I don't think they should be banned or anything. That's sometimes like I think Dockside Extortionist is a mistake and should be banned. And Thassa's Oracle was a mistake and should be banned. However, I don't feel that way about these commanders because I don't think they're problematic in the same way those cards are. But like it's just like my point with saying that is like, because we had they shouldn't exist in so much as the partners that we got should have been more like these ones where there was a theme, and they should have been more like the Commander Legends ones. Like the Commander Legends ones, honestly, I feel like were all home runs. Like I really liked all of them.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you said, and I'm right there with you with this deck being, feeling like the best designed deck. And also being right there with you with the power level of these commanders feeling appropriate. One thing I will say though is that, I'm a little less, and maybe you agree with me. I'm a little less low on Saskia in particular than the other 2 decks that we talked about, where Saskia also kind of feels like it has pretty reasonable internal synergy.
I agree. I agree with that.
And the partners like Tymna aside, feel appropriately powered and they, even with Tymna's current power level, she at least synergizes with what the deck's doing.
Right.
Yeah.
And like all 3 of the partners in that like fit the theme of what Saskia is doing. And I think like if you look at the rating that they gave that deck, they gave it like, what was it?
They gave it a B+.
B+. So like, I'd agree with that.
They gave the chaos. So the one that I didn't agree with.
Yeah, I don't agree with that at all.
They spent almost the entire time that they were talking about the Idris deck complaining about it. Honestly, like they weren't like complaining, but they spent a lot of time talking about the negatives of the Idris deck, and they both rated it A-.
I think there might have been a bit of a bias from that being the first deck that they rated. And it's possible that it was only after they started looking at like the other decks that they started sort of fine tuning their rating scale. Which, that can happen. you know, just imagine the teacher who has to rate like a bunch of like oral presentations in an elementary school class. And like the first one, they're like, oh, well, you know, that wasn't very good. But then like the rest of them are a train wreck. And it's like, oh, I guess the first one was pretty good and I should give it a better grade than I did, because otherwise everyone did terribly. Yeah, sort of along those lines.
I like moving this in, like transitioning to our last deck, which is the Brea deck. I actually like the Brea deck more than the Yidris deck. By a lot, actually. I think it's way more internally synergistic and makes a lot more sense. And the Yidris deck is, for what it's worth, entirely chaos, which was kind of the point of the deck. But so when we look at the Brea deck, the first partner, which is the allied color partner, I believe is the right word for it, is Silas, Ren, Seeker, Adept. If you're unfamiliar with Silas, Silas is a 2/2 artifact creature, human that costs 1 colorless, a blue, and a black, has Death Touch, and says whenever Silas Ren deals combat damage to a player, choose target artifact card in your graveyard. You may cast that card this turn. And so for a long time in cEDH, right, this didn't do anything. Like, nobody played this card. It's kind of been the butt of a lot of jokes in cEDH for a very long time. And even now it still is, but it's played alongside Rograk, so it seems a little bit more respectable, right? Like Pongo very famously got a turn one seat one win in our very first gameplay episode with Rograk Silas. So I mean, like Silas is there for the colors, but Silas does do some other stuff, right? Like Silas can be helpful.
I can start, I guess.
I hear a lot of silence, so I guess everybody disagrees with me.
It can be useful. I mean, so the exact thing that they were talking about, just not talking too much about the power level of this card, because I don't think this card is particularly great. About the design of this card, though, like the things that Gavin and Melissa were saying, it deals with the combat step. It makes you want to go to combat. It has Death Touch to enable that. It deals with your graveyard. It makes you cast artifacts from your graveyard. It is kind of a build around. It's a well-designed card. I think it just is a little bit lacking in the power department.
Which is fine. I mean, it's supposed to be half a card, right? Like, you get 2 commanders. Yeah. I don't know. I think that Silas is okay. Your face commander legitimately says like sacrifice artifacts, right?
Yeah.
So like that, it actually at least has some inherent sort of synergy with that game plan, that idea. But it's true that, like you probably, if you are building this deck with, Brea at the front of it and Silas in the deck, or, even just as like a Silas deck where you're really trying to do the Silas thing. And, one of the things that they touch upon is that like, there's sort of like only a finite number of artifacts that like you want to be playing repeatedly. You know what I mean? So you're either using Silas as like a recovery mechanism, which like, let's be honest, like that's not an exciting way to build a deck. That's not how people are probably going to build their artifact decks. Or you're just using him to recur like a small subset of artifacts. And like we already like see that this deck has like a few of those, like the capsules and stuff like that. There's even the like Ikra Wellspring and stuff like that. You're going to be playing like this egg style deck, and like it kind of just everything kind of pushes you in that direction of doing exactly that thing. So I don't know, like I get where they're coming from, where it feels like a little one note, but at the same time, like I don't know that necessarily has to be a bad thing. Like, there's so many commanders in this format that are one note, right? Like they kind of, you can read their text box and you're like, oh, I mean, like Korvold, for instance, like Korvold is pushing me to do like sacrifice things. And obviously it's much easier to break that with Korvold in particular. And like Korvold is a much, much stronger card, but like, you know what I mean? Like there's a very clear direction to take that deck, and there's like a very clear direction to take this commander. And so I disagree that that's necessarily such a bad thing. Some people like their commanders to sort of have a very clear focus and a very clear idea. And so I think Silas kind of fits into that mold.
One of the things I thought that was interesting is somebody in our YouTube comments last week on the Arden episode asked if anybody had considered Arden and Silas. And I actually don't think that's the worst combo in the world, just because they do seem like mutually beneficial, where if you lose an artifact, you can get it back with Silas. So if you lose one of your equipment, you can get it back. And
like
I think
literally the recursion, like resilience angle that I was talking about before.
Yeah. Like we were talking about that with the Arden Kraum deck. I think it was like a week or two ago. I think it was with Sick. And he was like, you should be playing like Goblin Welder in that deck. Whereas like with this, Silas Run kind of has a little bit of evasion, death touch, right? And so you can still do stuff with Arden attached to Silas, where you can do stuff that still do the whole. I mean, hell, you could put a Colossus Hammer on it, and that would be pretty fucking awesome. But like, if something gets destroyed, you can bring it back. Like, there's so many things that you could do with it that I actually think it's like not unreasonable to pursue an Arden Silas deck, if that makes sense, because they play off of each other, I think, in a good way, as compared to like Silas and Rograk, where Silas is strictly there for colors.
Hey, sometimes you cast him and maybe block.
And get back a, Jeweled Lotus or something?
Oh, no, block. You just block.
Okay.
But if you're that far with Silas Rograk, you're having a bad time already. Anyway.
But that's my opinion, As always, I like to go on these tangents about, hey, check out these things that we think are bad.
I don't really have much else for Silas. He isn't much of a talking point to me.
He's kind of like, there's the Silas colors is kind of what he's largely for.
He's the origin of the what do? You give me colors meme.
This is the episode that's going to make me brew a bunch of decks. God damn it. I hate it. Next up on our list is the next two will be the last two on our list, the red-white commanders. And the first one is Akiri Line-Slinger, who is a 0/3 core soldier ally that costs a red and a white. She has first strike and vigilance and gets +1/+0 for each artifact you control. So for a long time, there was a good while that Akiri and Thrasios were a pair together. Am I right? Like that used to be a pairing, right? For a minute. Or was like Akiri just in my imagination?
As much as like Thrasios Bruse.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, Sans Black Evolution is a deck, and then there was versions of that deck before we had Neoform and Eldritch Evolution. But
and then like people, especially people who are going down the more breachy road, would occasionally be doing Akiri. Just because at that point you're a little bit more incentivized to be playing artifacts instead of creatures, and you're kind of shifting the focus of the deck a little in that direction. So like, yeah, you get potentially a little bit more value out of your Akiri, just kind of being able to deal a lot of damage. But it's kind of not necessarily a major difference, all told. They're largely for colors.
Yeah, I mean, this card is a really good example of 1v1 balance that doesn't really matter in Commander, especially for cEDH, because they gave her Vigilance and First Strike, and we're basically like, okay, well, that's enough. This card's really, really powerful. And it's just stuff that doesn't really matter that much in a game of like cEDH, for example, until it is about combat.
Right.
I've played against this deck in casual EDH, and once you start sticking equipment and stuff on it, it can get pretty scary. But especially in 4 colors, you get all kinds of good stuff. So like, I don't know. I think Akiri is generally speaking fine, right? Because while you are getting that extra card in your hand, at least she's pushing you to, at least she's not giving you additional value, right? She's not snowballing.
Right.
And so she's, imminently answerable, and she is kind of encouraging you to build your deck in a particular way to, take better advantage of her. I don't know. She seems generally fine to me. And she also seems perfectly well balanced even for like 1v1. So she doesn't have that issue, because there's just like so much material that you need for her to get to a point where she's like really unmanageable. And I just don't ever see that actually happening in 1v1. So yeah, I don't know. Akiri's fine. She's well designed.
I'm just really glad I'm glad that they're aware of the Vigilance First Strike combo being like oppressive and bad, and like, okay, maybe we should chill on Vigilance First Strike combos.
Yeah.
Maybe we just give it Vigilance. Or just give it First Strike. Like,
I think the only other major point I have is that for a period of time, Akiri plus Miara was the only combo of partners that you could play with Luris in the command.
Oh, right. Yeah. I forgot about that.
That's the only other real notable thing about Akiri in my mind.
That's fair. On to our last partner of the day is Bruse Tarl, Boris Herder, everybody's favorite hunk of meat. Is that
hunk of meat?
That's what you want to call it.
Hunk of meat.
Hunky boy. Does that make more sense? Why did I say hunk of meat? Bruse Tarl is a 3/3 human ally. Costs 2 colorless, a red, and a white. That says whenever Bruse Tarl enters the battlefield or attacks, target creature you control gains double strike in lifelink until end of turn. So like you were saying earlier, this is kind of like prototypical deck or card that you see a lot in like those sort of Thrasios Evolution decks or Dawnwaker decks. It's usually a partner with Thrasios. Can be pretty relevant in combat, but it costs 4 mana. For some reason, I always think it costs 5 for some reason. But
it's so much worse if it costs 5.
It's
right. Yeah. That's why I've always been like, why does anybody play this? And then I'm like, oh, it's 4 mana.
Yeah. It's
a powerful card, works well with the partner mechanic. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he's the origin of the terminology of farm. Because he's a herder and lives on a farm.
Him and Tymna live together on the farm raising animals. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Tymna's taking care of the spider babies, and he's taking care of the oxen in the fields. Yeah.
Yeah.
I just added to the legend.
And then Jessica came around, and now you don't need Bruse.
Yeah. I mean, you know what? It's hard to say. I feel like Tymna might have downgraded looking at the card. But then again, Jessica
just gives you a win con in the command
just has
zone.
Excellent taste. Let's put it that way. I think Bruse Tarl at 4 mana, the whole Neoform into Seedborn Muse thing, kind of important. But otherwise, that text is pretty fair.
Fine.
Yeah, it's pretty fair. It's at a power level that I think commanders ought to be at. And I think that, the only other thing sort of note about Bruse Tarl for me is that he kind of reminds me of like the dark days of Boros design for Commander, where it's like, man, these cards are really not interesting, and all they do is combat stuff. Like literally all of it is combat. It's never about like value in combat or like anything to do with like other red and white themes that like kind of push you away from combat and into more of like an interesting combo or like engine based strategy. It's just get in there, hit hard, and lose the game. Like that's just what it is. So like, I don't know. Bruse Tarl, I guess, like from that perspective, I find just like a fine card.
Right. So
yeah, I mean,
go ahead. Sorry.
The only other thing that I would note, card design wise, on this one is that like this is definitely a card that they took advantage of the fact that you know that you're going to have another card in the command zone with, which I appreciate and like, which is that it ETBs and you can give double strike to the other commander.
That's a good point, actually. That's a really good point. Yeah, I think more than any of like the other commanders, he does that. You know, maybe with the exception of Tymna.
Yeah. I think all the other ones are kind of generic, and maybe you can argue for Ludevic.
Right.
So I know we've been talking for 2.5 hours, but I want to wrap this up on one final question that everybody's going to ask. And they also asked in their episode as well, should partner be ever used again? And like, should it come back? I guess is the question. Like, what are your thoughts on it, guys? I have opinions about it.
Yeah,
a lot of people
I think we all do.
We all do. So who wants to go first?
I guess I'll hop in. You know, while I still have attention to devote to the topic.
Oh baby, I'm on Vyvanse right now. I'm like zoned in. Baby.
Yeah.
I recently got my ADHD meds back, and I've just been like a machine.
So, I think actually, probably the one thing that hooked me into this episode, by Gavin and Melissa, I should say. And that's not to say that like the entire series hasn't been excellent, because I think it has been. And it, you know, I really appreciate it, that they're doing that. And there's like a lot of amazing insights from these episodes, into the design process. And it's cool to see kind of where they're at now. You know, what really comes through in this episode is just how much we and WotC have learned about designing cards for Commander.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of gives me hope, where before I didn't really have much hope at all that we can be more responsible in how we design cards for Commander. And I think that Gavin, you know, was sort of on the right track when he said that, you know, partner was not a mistake inherently, but the partners that we printed, many of them were mistakes. You know, that it's not just like, you know, I think that's just an eminently fair way to put it, and an eminently correct way to put it. You know, he is owning up to the fact that, like, yes, some of these partners clearly were not well designed. You know, they're clearly mistakes, and you know, we in the cEDH sphere are living with those mistakes to this day. But
and enjoying them deeply.
Some of us are enjoying them, and, you know, some of us are enjoying them sometimes and not enjoying them in other situations, but I digress. You know, it goes beyond partner, but partners are kind of like a figurehead for that because of how much they've warped our format. And that's not to say that mistakes haven't been made since then, because Dockside Extortionist is a card. But
please ban that.
Yeah. You know,
I didn't say anything. I don't know what you're talking about.
Pretty clear, though, that there's been sort of like a deflation in the power levels. The power level of the commander decks that have been released since, you know, like the 2017, you know, even extending into 2018. But, you know, like less and less kind of thing. Really, I would say starting to drop off after these commander decks, but, you know, hardest after 2017, probably. So, you know, that's good news, right? Because it means that, you know, probably we won't have like major shakeups the same to the format, such that we end up finding ourselves with, like, you know, a before 2016 format and like after Commander 2016 format, which is kind of something that I've talked about multiple times over this episode, and in the past. You know, I think the partners that we got in Commander Legends, for the most part, were pretty good. And Gavin also addresses the fact that, you know, while they're not all perfect, and, you know, there's a few of them that are kind of standouts and I think are really, really powerful in the current metagame, if it wasn't for the fact that we had other partners defining the metagame before those cards were released, if those were like the first batch of partners that we ever got, we would probably be like, okay, like these are strong, but like reasonable, like not completely unreasonable. We got like maybe 5 partner combinations that are like, quite good. And, it's hard to say because we would be talking about 2-color combinations, like 2-color Malcolm.
Way more, yeah.
Right? We would be talking about like 2-color Tevesh. So like from some perspective, the mistake remains those first 2-color partners. And the partners that come since kind of just like, they add options. And I know this is something that you've said multiple times, Callahan, that you feel that like the only way to fix partners once they've been done is to print more, such that there's more options, such that they feel less samey. I understand where you're coming from with that argument. I think it's a valid argument. And I think that probably a lot of people subscribe to that argument. I think that like,
including WotC more than likely.
Yeah, including WotC, clearly. I personally feel like there's more that you could conceivably do, but that won't be done to address the issues with partner, like bannings and stuff like that. Obviously that's not going to happen. So we have to live with the fact that that's not going to happen.
I think bannings is ultimately a net loss for the format. I don't think, and that's why I'm ultimately pro print more, because, and I think it was Alex Kessler on Twitter, was either last night or this morning, put out a poll that asked, should we ban more cards in EDH or unban cards in EDH? And a vast majority of the people would rather you unban cards than ban cards. And I think
I do wonder, how that splits up along competitive casual lines though, right? Like in terms of poll numbers.
I mean, Kessler has a pretty diverse following, to be fair.
Right.
But it's not like Playing with Power asked that question, right? Like,
yeah.
But I mean, the big, what I'm trying to get at here is that I think there is in competitive circles, and I think this extends beyond EDH. I think this goes over to, I think you see it a lot in Modern, where there's always this notion of the way to fix the meta is to ban a card, right? We saw this with, I think the deck that I really saw this a lot with was the Hogak deck. They were like, okay, we're going to ban this card, then we're going to ban this card. They banned 3 different cards before that deck finally kind of like went away. And basically, because of the way competitive people play in those circles, they don't play things that are good that they enjoy, but might not be like the best deck or whatever in the format, or don't like to play the counterplay to the good deck, if that makes sense. And I think that this notion that banning cards is the answer is ultimately how you end up with formats in shambles, right? Like the big issues like that I ultimately have with Modern or Modern, Standard, hell, Historic is I just don't like how much they ban stuff. And I tend to be a very conservative person when it comes to what should we ban and what constitutes enough to be banned. And that's part of why I don't think the way you fix it is banning the cards. Like, I think that I actually will create more animosity.
I feel like I couldn't disagree more, at least about that argument in the context of like Modern and Legacy, like competitive formats. And there's maybe a certain nuance to be had when we're talking about EDH, where what you're saying is possibly more accurate. But I won't get into that for the moment. We could talk about that, and I'd have to give it some more thought really before I weighed in on it. But like when we're looking at Modern, and let's take Legacy as the first example. I think people are in many cases fairly burnt out on Legacy at the moment. You have a lot of people clamoring for a ban in Legacy, to a card like Ragavan or a card like Expressive Iteration. even going so far as people asking for a ban for like days, if not like Murktide Tyrant or like some combination of the above. Some people feel that you also need to ban Uro. So it seems like there is interest in a ban in that format, and we have seen that borne out even in like competitive legacy leagues on MTGO, where people have like, essentially registered decks that are just like 60 mountains out of protest, with the current state of the format and stuff like that. And, attendance dropping off, people can get fed up with formats because of certain cards being oppressive. And, I think we saw that, even before Ragavan with like Underworld Breach, for instance. And you kind of have that happening every once in a while. There's sort of two solutions in my mind to that. There's either like you get a new card that like shakes the format such that there's like new interest in it, even while keeping those other broken cards in the format. And so the power level of the format as a whole has increased. And, you kind of have to keep pushing the power level so that people stay interested. Or else, you ban the kind of problematic cards that are causing play patterns that people aren't enjoying. If we look at Modern, I think Modern is kind of in shambles right now. I think Modern is probably at its like least interesting that it has been in a very long time because of the companion meta. I think people are getting pretty fed up with like just how much companions have penetrated into that format, how they define the format right now. And even companions being nerfed didn't really do enough in that regard. So, I don't follow Modern quite as much as Legacy, but I do know that like, from what I've seen, it just kind of feels like people aren't even really talking about Modern that much around me anymore. And I barely see any content online for it. Not compared to as much as, the amount that I used to see. You see more historic, you see more arena, people playing more of that kind of stuff. And, and as always, people are playing Commander and stuff like that. Commander is kind of, making out like a bandit under the circumstances, from at least the content perspective. So yeah, I don't agree that banning things is a net negative for other formats. I think more often than not, when there's a card that is problematic, it's a net positive in these other formats that we have seen. It has been a net positive to ban something. People get interested in the format again. People feel like, oh, I'm finally, ding dong, the witch is dead. And I can play my favorite format again.
Oh, I wasn't saying like in Modern and in Legacy that it's a net negative. I meant more like banning Thrasios, Tymna, and those, I think, is a net negative for our format.
In Commander, it's a different context, right? So like, I agree that's a different conversation.
My issue with the way that they ban stuff in Modern and Legacy is that I don't feel that the decision. I mean, this is a podcast unto itself. Yeah. But we're already at 2:45, so what the hell? My issue is that with the way that they approach bans in other formats is that it feels a bit like it feels very influenced by keyboard warriors.
You're saying it feels very like reaction, like react.
It feels very reactionary.
Yeah.
And I think probably the card that I will always think of for this is Faithless Looting, where people just yelled about Faithless Looting and kept yelling about it until they banned it. And I don't know that the format was better because of the banning of that card. And
I think after Modern Masters 2, though, sorry, not Modern Masters 2.
Modern Horizons.
No, Modern Horizons 2, yes. I'm very glad that Faithless Looting is not in that format in Modern.
But I mean, like, it's one of those things where if it was banned now because it was doing something I'd be like extraordinarily broken, I'd be like, yeah, sure. But I've never felt like Faithless Looting previously was like, oh man, we need to ban this and then kill off an entire, like, 2 whole decks. There's also this other thing where they're afraid to pull things off of the ban list. And then we saw with Stoneforge Mystic and Jace, they were perfectly fine. And it's just, I don't like big ban lists as like a rule, but that's also just kind of like, I think the way they've approached Pioneer and that ban list has been like the correct way of doing it personally. Like I like the approach with Pioneer, even though their like Pioneer support has been ass. I think Pioneer, like the philosophy going into it, I like a lot more, but that's a whole other discussion. That's right.
We can sum it up as Callahan doesn't like BBLs, right? Big ban lists.
Yeah.
Yeah. So now I've been waiting with bated breath. So. So I would not or do you want to repeat the question since we've been rambling for so long? Or?
I mean, the question is, if you could undo partners, would you, or were they a mistake and should they make more, I guess, is like a bunch of questions.
The first batch.
So,
yes.
The first batch. I'm of the opinion that I would not undo Commander or undo partners in Commander, even before partner. And then Gavin and Melissa commented on this, that like partner was a solution to a problem that they were eventually going to have to have.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then even before C16, we have examples like Derevi and some of the other commanders that do things that other legendary creatures have never done. It is literally their job to, as they were saying as negatives in some of these evaluations, it is their job to break the rules of Commander, add new things to the game of Commander, and then progress it forward, basically.
Yeah.
As much as some people don't like that, it is what their job is. They need to make new cards that do new things that haven't been done before. And without partner, we wouldn't have 4-color commanders, period, other than these.
There's the face commanders, right?
4 face commanders. But yeah, that's kind of the point that I'm making. Without partner, it solves the problem of having no 4-color commanders without having to make specific cards for
like keyword soup and all of that.
Exactly. And a lot of 4-color cards run into the problem of Atraxa, where it's 4 keywords, 4 colors, 4/4.
Well, they added
look at
the
Omnath,
keywords
right?
later, right? That's what they said in the episode. Yeah,
I think so. Yeah.
But I mean, look at like Omnath, right? Like Omnath's just like ability soup, right? Like it just.
Yeah, a lot of 4-color things, even the Nephilim, are kind of just ability soup, keyword soup, just text soup when they add more colors. For whatever reason, 4 colors seems to be a pain point with Wizards card design, where it isn't 5 colors, so they don't know how to define it. For 5 color, they can kind of be like, do what you want. In 4 color, they usually struggle to hit what they're aiming for, is what it seems in my opinion,
they struggle.
At least from a design
I think they struggle with 5-color design as well, for what it's worth. But I understand where you're coming from. It feels like, at least with 5-color design, they're more willing to like print cards where you're like, oh, this card is like obviously not a blue card at all, but like, okay, whatever, it's 5 colors. Like you weren't going to make it 4 colors, so might as well make it 5 colors. And then like with 4 colors, it's
exactly.
like, oh, I mean, chances are this is probably a 3-color card ultimately, but like you threw on like a little something to make it feel 4 colors. Okay.
Yeah.
And it's definitely a space that like they've also at this point in like design history, they've explored wedges and shards, and it's things that they've designed for. They didn't really ever explore 4-color combinations and what they meant or what they didn't mean mechanically. And so they didn't really have anything to go off of when they made these.
Yeah, I think that's...
And partner definitely helps fill that gap. And it's something that was going to need to exist
and it also,
in the future.
I believe they said this in this too. They always wanted to do like a limited commander format, and partner
exactly. That's kind of what I was alluding to.
Makes that possible. Like you can't really do a limited commander format without partner.
Right. I think the mechanic as a whole, is not the problem. And I've articulated this, at the beginning of the episode. I think Melissa and Gavin do a good job of articulating it, and we're articulating it right now. It solves problems. It from like the limited perspective, even from like the design of 4-color commanders, it solves problems because now you can design 2-color commanders and then, you mix and match them to get up to 4 colors. The issue kind of has always been the specific designs of a few of these commanders. And so I think it's interesting that these are badly designed commanders from the perspective of like being partners, but also just like as standalone commanders in some cases.
They're just super generic.
They're just badly designed.
Oh yeah. I mean, if we jump to, I have notes from their entire episode and it's abstract. Melissa and Gavin just talking about partner. They both give it a D+ to C range on their abstract, just partner as a concept in a vacuum. Their execution in this specific scenario, though, they both give it just it's a fail.
Mm-hmm.
It did not work.
Yeah, Gavin was very, very clear about that he thought it was just a straight F. Because, keeping in mind the things we were talking about before and the things that they touch upon is, having access to more colors is inherently strong, and they didn't really have that experience in design and in commander decks to necessarily grasp that. And then having an extra card is inherently strong. So your cards have to be weak.
Yep. There's also something interesting, though, that I think Phoenix brought up that I think might inform some of that a little bit is... So I think Commander changed the way we look at, or people look at card design, in the way that you had to think of what do these color identities do much more explicitly, right? Like, we weren't clamoring for white card draw really before Commander, right? We weren't clamoring for improvements in green really before Commander. And I think what these cards show is it's a relic of its age before we've really started to clearly define what each of these color pairings do and what these sort of things should look like. Like, now we have a very clear idea of what a Boros commander should look like, what a Izzet commander should look like, or what a Orzhov commander should look like, even though we don't have any good ones, right? We have like very clear ideas of what that looks like. In 2016, I don't think we did. Outside of like Mizzix, right?
There's also a difference between mechanics, which they, for a long time, I don't remember exactly when they started doing it, but they defined what colors get what mechanics. But they never really defined what color identities get things.
Exactly.
So once you're above a single color, they never really hit on what they wanted cards to have.
And that's kind of,
at this point,
that's kind of what I'm hinting at, right? Is like,
sort of.
I think Commander made you have to.
I'm hand waving a little bit.
I think Commander made them have to think about, like, what do these colors, what is their thing that they do? Because their legendary creatures need to reflect those things. And I think these cards certainly come from a time before they really had those definitions and knew those things. And so instead of trying out card designs on them, they just slap generic stuff on them.
And I think a lot of that came from, at least in my opinion, this came from the fact that this entire commander set was top down. We're making a 4-color commander for every pairing, and not, oh, I have a commander that's going to do X.
Right.
And it needs to have these colors because it's doing X or things like that.
I hear where you're coming from, Callahan. I have a slightly different take on that, though. I feel like the commander and legendary creature design, was not so far off of like modern color pie principles back, before this set was released. The commanders we played back then really felt very strongly within their part of the pie. I think, I don't know that we've necessarily more rigidly defined these things. I think what it kind of boils down to, and where I feel like maybe you're missing the forest for the trees to some extent, is that partners create an environment where the color pie no longer matters because you've got all of the colors, right? Or you've got such a large part of the color pie and access to it that that whole idea breaks down. And so we're returning to, respecting the color pie in Commander design, where, what partners did is they eroded that. And that was a major failing with them because of how generic they were, at least the problematic ones.
So I think my point that I'm trying to make is like, so imagine like, let's say a card like Cole, like I think like now we know really, like before we kind of had an idea, but we didn't have like good Boros commanders that do a thing, right? Like they all kind of sucked for Commander. They weren't really designed with Commander in mind, right? Like we hadn't had those cards yet.
They did Boros
like
things, but
right,
whatever that meant.
But what I guess what I'm getting at is the format of Commander, not just, I guess to add on to what I was saying is, I guess it's not just the fact that you had to have the color identity, but also how does that color identity work in the space of a multiplayer game? Right.
Right.
Because, and I think they hadn't defined that yet, if that makes more sense.
That makes more sense. I think what it boils down to, though, is fundamentally that they're realizing that there are certain immutables that like every color needs to have access to for multiplayer considerations, card draw, ramp being the two big ones. And so that's where they've been trying to seed that into more colors. So, from a certain perspective, you can look at that either as like how you're looking at it, which is sort of, it's defining the boundaries of what the color identities are. But the other way to look at it is the inverse of that, which is erosion of the boundaries of color identity, right? For multiplayer. So, I think that probably we could talk about this for another hour because I think,
no kidding.
I think just in pointing out that fact that there's two potential, I think in some ways equally valid ways of looking at that. Just in pointing out that fact, you kind of come up to this potential discussion that's really fruitful. But yeah, I think I can't commit to that currently.
Yeah, that's fair. We have been talking for 3 hours. And if you had asked me this morning when we were prepping a little bit, if this would be a 3-hour episode, I would have said probably not. It will probably be like an hour and a half. We won't have a ton to say. And then here we are. But I think this has been good. I think having these discussions and really giving the cEDH perspective on these things is also very important, because I think we tend to be impacted the greatest by mistakes like these. You know what I mean? But
and I think I've been watching this series as it's been going on, and this episode, I think they mentioned cEDH 3 or 4 times, and I don't think they've mentioned cEDH once before in this entire series so far. And I think that's a good indication of
they are aware
this set.
And even when they weren't mentioning it outright, they were mentioning it.
Right.
Right. Like, because Thrasios is not a problem in casual, but they seem to have made it the poster child for like a major failure of design. So it seems like they're absolutely considering us an important demographic,
which
for design.
Further proves my theory that WotC wants to have a big tournament that's Commander. I've been theorizing about this for how many years, Jeremy?
I don't know.
A lot of years, and I stand by it. I think that just hammers home the point. And with that, thank you all for joining us. Just a couple of things before we head out. I do want to let you guys know that next week is going to be a very special episode. Next week is going to be our 2021 cEDH Awards. This is something I wanted to do last year, and we kind of did with Play to Win. But this year we're doing it in a real like award show type way. So we've got a bunch of different presenters. Some of the people, I could just tell you who's going to be there. Vince Pleasant Kenobi will be there. Sage is going to be presenting. Michael David Lynch from I Hate Your Deck. Ian from Comedian. Alan Mental Misplay. Josh Second Seven, Commander Mechanic. The Who Brewed This Cast. Alex Kessler, Scott Cullen, Moderately Anonymous, NTG, our boy Spleenface, MTG Pro and SCG Tour Pro, Brian Koval is going to be presenting. Our friend Ryan from Playing with Power, Nathan the Hermit Druid, everybody loves Nathan. And of course, from famously from the Secret Life of an American Teenager, but more importantly, Stacked EDH, Ken Bauman, and of course the crazy AI Rebel Son will be presenting the awards next week and hosting the cEDH Awards this year will be myself, Pongo, and Cobblepot. So make sure to tune in, and that's going to be a really fun episode. You'll get to see our smiling faces on that one. So I'm really excited. So stay tuned for that. I've been working on this video for this podcast video / thing for about a month and a half, 2 months. So I'm really excited about this. So with that being said, thank you all for joining us today. Would like to remind you that if you want to follow us on Twitter, you can head over to Sculpty Boys on Twitter, or you can find a direct link in our link tree in the description below. Want to also give an extra shout out and thanks to our high tier patrons, Justin, Michael Levine, CZ, Dionyches, James Holly, Jason Bialik, Matt Boehner, and Senior Coupon. If you too would like to become a patron, you can head on over to patreon.com/themindsculptors or check out the link in the description. Thank you again for joining us, and from all of us here at The Mind Sculptors, I'm Callahan, and we'll see you next time.
I'm in line with the stars, I'm in sync with the earth. 10 toes deep, flower child from the turf. I never switch sides, like even when I die, I'ma ride for the squad, let our ties in the hearse. I've been on a vibe, kinda hard to describe. I'm in between, I'm good and it's fine, but I'm tired of the grind. Then I come alive in the night to realize I'm in the middle of the time of my life. I never sold pack for the stack, never lied on the rap. Got a bag from the way that I write it. Queen looking Tyson, do that ass survive, doing 80 to the house. Then I hit it to the sky, change haters on a tirade. Talking to the crib in the face, be still, let that hate stuff fade. We all want the same, we all want a meal in the safe. I wanna live like I'm trying to reach enlightenment. Trail spill from my lips, feel big from the bib. Take a sip till I pass out. Try and get grit, but it don't make sense, cause you can lose life on this fast route. Yeah, turn thoughts to a cash cow. I might flip that to the glass house. I don't need the accolades, I'm in love with the chase. I just wanna eat, save a spot at the table. Beast with the slap, hit myself on the map. You long with the wind, but we knowing that it's cap. 5-hour flights, couple nights at the flat. To be real, couldn't see me making moves while I'm at. I'm still on the grind, limit time when I chat. Burning down sage, keep the demons away. When I write it, give a piece of myself to the page. I don't do it for the praise, love, that's just how I'm made.
Truth in the glass in the mirror.
Yeah.
Do it at me, old man, tryna pass in the fear. You're the first one to talk, but the last one to hear. Eyes blurry, but I couldn't see the ass, and he cleared down.
You can't have that cookie, Elmo. Rocco wants to eat it.